Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a peaceful journey through one of history's most fascinating stories of invisible power, the remarkable life of Queen Caroline of Ansbach, a woman who never officially ruled, yet wielded more influence than most crowned monarchs. Caroline's story is one that will gently unfold over the next 3 hours, taking us through the corridors of 18th century European courts, the drawing rooms where political deals were made in whispered conversations, and the private chambers where a brilliant woman shaped the destiny of nations through wit, charm, and unparalleled intelligence. Before you settle in for this extended journey through time, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Perhaps you could share what draws you to stories of powerful women in history, or maybe tell us about a time when you've seen someone wielding quiet influence behind the scenes. Don't be shy. Our Sleepy Crown family loves hearing your thoughts, and your comments help other history lovers discover these soothing tales. And if this gentle storytelling helps you drift toward peaceful sleep, a gentle like would mean the world to us. And subscribing ensures you won't miss future journeys through history's most captivating stories. Tonight's tale will softly guide you through Caroline's transformation from a German orphan to England's most powerful queen consort, exploring her political genius, her championing of Enlightenment ideals, her complex family relationships, and her enduring love story with King George II. We'll discover how she managed to rule an empire without wearing a crown, how she kept a kingdom stable through her intelligence and diplomacy, and how her influence echoed through generations of British history. So settle in beneath your softest blankets, let your breathing slow and deepen, and allow the gentle whispers from Georgian England to carry you into the most restful sleep. Welcome to our extended family of dreamers, and thank you for trusting us with your journey into slumber. Caroline, later known as Queen Caroline of Ansbach, entered this world on a crisp March morning in 1683 in the small German principality of Ansbach, nestled in the rolling hills of Franconia. The castle where she drew her first breath was modest by royal standards, but it would prove to be the birthplace of one of history's most remarkable queens, though she would never know it in those early tender moments of life. Her father, John Frederick, Margrave of Brandenburg-Ansbach, was a man of gentle disposition who ruled over one of the smallest territories in the vast patchwork of German states that made up the Holy Roman Empire. The Margraviate of Ansbach was hardly a jewel in any crown, but it was home, and it was where little Caroline, christened Wilhelmina Charlotte Caroline, would spend the first precious years of her childhood, unaware that destiny had far grander plans for her than the quiet life of a minor German princess. Those early years passed peacefully in the small court at Ansbach, where Caroline's world consisted of her beloved mother, Princess Eleanor Erdmuther of Saxe-Eisenach, her younger brother William Frederick, and the comfortable routines of castle life. Her mother, a woman of refinement and gentle intelligence, would spend long hours with her daughter, teaching her to read and instilling in her the basic courtesies expected of a princess, no matter how minor their principality might be. But even in those innocent days, there were signs of the extraordinary mind that would one day captivate kings and philosophers alike. Caroline possessed an unusual curiosity for a child her age, asking endless questions about the world beyond their castle walls, absorbing stories of distant lands and foreign courts. With an intensity that both charmed and concerned her parents, she would sit for hours listening to the tales told by traveling merchants and diplomats, her young mind already reaching beyond the confines of her small world. The warmth of those early years came to an abrupt and devastating end when Caroline was just 3 years old. Her father, John Frederick, fell victim to the merciless plague of smallpox that swept through Europe in those days, claiming lives regardless of rank or station. The disease struck him down in the prime of his life, at merely 32 years of age, leaving behind a grieving widow, 2 small children, and a principality suddenly vulnerable in a world where strength often determined survival. For young Caroline, her father's death was her first encounter with the cruel realities of life, though she was far too young to understand the full implications of this loss. What she did comprehend, with the stark clarity that sometimes comes to children in times of crisis, was that her world had fundamentally changed. The castle that had once echoed with her father's laughter now seemed somehow smaller, quieter, filled with the whispered conversations of adults trying to determine what would become of them all. Her mother, Princess Eleanor, found herself in an impossible position. As a widow with 2 young children and no substantial inheritance, she faced the harsh reality that their comfortable life at Ansbach could not continue. The principality would pass to John Frederick's heir, but there would be little provision for his widow and children. It was a common enough story in those times, when women's security depended entirely upon the men in their lives, and when death could transform a princess into a burden overnight. With heavy hearts and lighter purses, Princess Eleanor gathered her children and what belongings they could carry. Leaving the only home Caroline had ever known, they made their way to Eleanor's family seat at Eisenach, where they hoped to find refuge and support from her relatives. But the transition from the relative comfort of Ansbach to the uncertain charity of distant relations was a harsh lesson for young Caroline in the precarious nature of life for women. Even those born to noble houses, the years at Eisenach were marked by genteel poverty, the kind that maintains appearances while counting every coin. Caroline learned early the art of making do with less, of finding dignity in reduced circumstances, and of understanding that security was never guaranteed, no matter one's birth. These lessons, absorbed unconsciously by a child too young to articulate them, would prove invaluable in the years to come, giving her an appreciation for stability and a fierce determination never again to find herself at the mercy of circumstances beyond her control. Her mother did her best to provide for Caroline and William Frederick, ensuring they received the education befitting their noble blood despite their reduced circumstances. Caroline continued her lessons in reading, writing, basic mathematics, and the fundamentals of courtly behavior. But there was an awareness now, a shadow that had not existed in their protected life at Ansbach, that their future was far from certain. When Caroline was 9 years old, her world shifted once again, though this time the change would ultimately prove to be providential. Her mother, Princess Eleanor, received a marriage proposal that offered both love and security, though it would mean yet another upheaval for the children. Johann Georg IV, Elector of Saxony, was a man of considerable power and wealth, and his interest in the widowed princess represented a chance for stability that she could not afford to refuse. The move to Dresden, seat of the Saxon court, opened Caroline's eyes to a world far grander than anything she had known. The Elector's palace was a magnificent structure, filled with art treasures, vast libraries, and the constant bustle of one of Germany's most important courts. For a young girl who had spent her early years in the modest castle at Ansbach and the reduced circumstances of Eisenach, Dresden must have seemed like a fairy tale palace. However, the fairy tale proved to be short-lived and somewhat tarnished. Elector Johann Georg IV, while generous enough in providing for his new wife and stepchildren, was a man of pronounced weaknesses. His court was notorious for its excesses, his personal life scandalous even by the relaxed moral standards of the time, and his attention span for domestic happiness proved tragically brief. Young Caroline observed it all with the sharp eyes of a child, who had already learned that the world could change without warning. She watched her mother navigate the complex social dynamics of the Saxon court, managing to maintain her dignity while her husband pursued his various pleasures with little regard for discretion or consequence. It was here that Caroline first learned the delicate art of court survival, how to remain gracious while guarded, how to participate in social rituals while protecting one's inner self. The elector's lifestyle, predictably, caught up with him. After only 2 years of marriage to Princess Eleanor, he contracted smallpox, not from any noble pursuit, but from one of his mistresses. The disease that had claimed Caroline's father now took her stepfather as well, and once again, she found herself part of a household thrust into uncertainty by the sudden death of its male protector. But Princess Eleanor had learned from her previous widowhood. She had secured a more favourable position during her brief second marriage, and rather than immediately fleeing Dresden, she managed to maintain her household there for 2 more years. These proved to be important years for Caroline, now entering adolescence, as they allowed her to observe and learn from one of the most sophisticated courts in Germany. During these years in Dresden, Caroline's education expanded beyond the basic accomplishments expected of a minor princess. The Saxon court, for all its moral shortcomings, was a centre of learning and culture. Caroline encountered books that opened new worlds to her, art that spoke to her developing aesthetic sensibilities, and conversations that challenged her young mind to consider ideas beyond the immediate concerns of court life. It was also in Dresden that Caroline first encountered the religious and philosophical questions that would fascinate her throughout her life. The Saxon court was officially Lutheran, but the cosmopolitan nature of its courtiers meant that Caroline was exposed to various streams of Christian thought, as well as the early stirrings of what would become known as Enlightenment philosophy. These intellectual seeds, planted in her adolescent mind, would bloom magnificently in the years to come. However, this period of relative stability and growth came to an end when Caroline was 13 years old. Her mother, Princess Eleanor, succumbed to illness in 1696, leaving Caroline and her brother William Frederick orphaned in a foreign court where they had no natural protectors. The death of her mother was a devastating blow to Caroline, removing not only her sole remaining parent, but also the person who had been her constant companion and guide through all their various upheavals. The practical implications of their orphan state were immediately apparent. While the Saxon court was too sophisticated and well-mannered to simply cast out 2 noble children, it was equally clear that Caroline and William Frederick could not remain indefinitely as wards of a court where they had no blood connections. Arrangements needed to be made, and quickly, for their future care and education. Fortunately, Princess Eleanor had not been without friends and connections. During her time in Dresden, she had maintained correspondence with various members of the extended network of German nobility, and among these was Sophia Charlotte, Queen of Prussia. Sophia Charlotte had known Princess Eleanor since their youth, and had always harboured warm feelings for her and her children. When news of Princess Eleanor's death reached Berlin, Queen Sophia Charlotte immediately extended an invitation for Caroline and William Frederick to join her household. It was an act of genuine kindness, but it was also a decision that would prove to be one of the most consequential in Caroline's life, setting her on a path that would lead to intellectual awakening, political sophistication, and ultimately a crown. The journey from Dresden to Berlin marked the end of Caroline's childhood and the beginning of her transformation into the remarkable woman she would become. As her carriage carried her away from the Saxon court toward an uncertain but promising future in Prussia, 13-year-old Caroline could not have imagined that she was travelling toward one of the most enlightened courts in Europe, where her mind would be shaped by some of the greatest thinkers of the age. Queen Sophia Charlotte of Prussia was a woman unlike any Caroline had encountered in her young life. Born Princess Sophia Charlotte of Hanover, she was the daughter of the Electress Sophia, herself a woman of extraordinary learning and political acumen. Sophia Charlotte had inherited her mother's intellectual gifts and had married Frederick III, Elector of Brandenburg, who would become the first king of Prussia in 1701, making her the first Queen of Prussia. But it was not her royal status that made Sophia Charlotte extraordinary. It was her mind. She was a philosopher in her own right, a woman who corresponded with Leibniz, who hosted salons where the greatest thinkers of the age gathered to debate questions of philosophy, theology, and natural science. Her court at Berlin was rapidly becoming one of the intellectual centers of Europe, a place where ideas mattered more than protocol, where a brilliant conversation was valued above a perfect curtsy. Into this remarkable environment stepped Caroline, still grieving her mother's death, but possessed of a quick intelligence that immediately caught Queen Sophia, Charlotte's attention. The Queen, who had no daughters of her own, saw in Caroline not just an orphan in need of care, but a mind ready for cultivation. She took the young girl under her wing with genuine affection, but also with the deliberate intention of providing her with an education that would prepare her for whatever destiny awaited. The transformation that began to occur in Caroline during her first months at the Prussian court was remarkable. Her previous education, while adequate for a minor German princess, had been limited in scope and depth. Queen Sophia Charlotte immediately set about expanding Caroline's intellectual horizons, introducing her to classical literature, contemporary philosophy, advanced mathematics, and the natural sciences. But it was not simply a matter of academic instruction. Queen Sophia Charlotte's approach to education was revolutionary for its time, particularly in its application to a young woman. She believed that true learning came not from rote memorization, but from questioning, discussing, and thinking deeply about ideas. Caroline found herself encouraged to express opinions, to challenge concepts, and to engage in the kind of intellectual discourse that would have been unthinkable in most courts of the period. The most extraordinary aspect of Caroline's education at Berlin was her exposure to Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, the great philosopher and mathematician who was a regular guest at Queen Sophia Charlotte's court. Leibniz, one of the towering intellectual figures of the age, took a genuine interest in the bright young woman who asked such thoughtful questions and displayed such eagerness to learn. Under Leibniz's guidance, Caroline was introduced to concepts that few women of her era ever encountered. She studied metaphysics and natural philosophy, learned about the mathematical principles that govern the natural world, and engaged in discussions about the nature of God, the soul, and human reason. These conversations with Leibniz would prove to be among the most formative experiences of Caroline's intellectual development, establishing patterns of thought and inquiry that would serve her throughout her life. What made these intellectual pursuits even more remarkable was that they occurred alongside Caroline's more traditional education in the arts and graces expected of a princess. She learned to speak French fluently, mastered the intricacies of court etiquette, developed her musical abilities, and acquired all the social skills necessary for success in aristocratic society. But unlike most young women of her class, these traditional accomplishments were supplemented by a thorough grounding in philosophy, theology, and natural science. Queen Sophia Charlotte also ensured that Caroline understood the practical realities of political life. She was encouraged to observe court proceedings, to understand the delicate balance of interests that governed relations between different German states, and to appreciate the role that women could play in politics, even when that role was officially limited. Caroline learned to read people as carefully as she read books, to understand the motivations and ambitions that drove political action. The relationship between Caroline and Queen Sophia Charlotte deepened over the years they spent together. The Queen, who had always regretted not having daughters, found in Caroline the intellectual companion she had longed for, while Caroline discovered in Sophia Charlotte not just a guardian, but a mentor who understood and nurtured her extraordinary potential. The bond between them was one of genuine affection and mutual respect, a relationship that would influence Caroline's approach to mentorship and education throughout her later life. During her time in Berlin, Caroline also developed the religious and philosophical outlook that would characterize her throughout her life. Under the influence of Queen Sophia Charlotte and Leibniz, she embraced a form of Lutheranism that was both devout and intellectually sophisticated, one that welcomed questions and philosophical inquiry rather than demanding blind faith. This approach to religion would later serve her well in navigating the complex theological disputes that characterized 18th century European politics. As Caroline matured from adolescence into young womanhood, it became increasingly clear that her guardians had succeeded in creating something quite remarkable. A princess who combined intellectual brilliance with social grace, theological sophistication with political awareness, and genuine learning with practical wisdom. By the time she reached her early 20s, Caroline had been transformed from an orphaned German princess of modest prospects into one of the most accomplished and desirable young women in European aristocratic society. Word of Caroline's remarkable qualities began to spread throughout the interconnected world of European royalty. Her beauty was noted. She was described as having striking blue eyes, golden hair, and a pleasingly rounded figure that accorded with the aesthetic preferences of the time. But more importantly, her reputation for intelligence and learning began to attract attention from royal houses across Europe, who were seeking suitable brides for their sons. The first major proposal came from an unexpected quarter, the Archduke Charles of Austria, who would later become Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI. This was an extraordinarily prestigious offer, one that would have made Caroline one of the most powerful women in Europe. However, acceptance would have required her to convert from Lutheranism to Catholicism, something that Caroline, despite her youth, refused to consider. Her refusal of this proposal demonstrated both the strength of her religious convictions and her remarkable independence of mind. Many young women in her position, faced with the prospect of becoming Holy Roman Empress, would have been willing to change their religion for such worldly advantages. But Caroline's education had given her something more valuable than ambition, the intellectual framework to understand that some compromises were too fundamental to make, that personal integrity was more important than political advancement. This decision to refuse the Archduke's proposal, while it closed one path to power, actually enhanced Caroline's reputation throughout Protestant Europe. She was seen as a young woman of principle, someone who valued her faith above her ambitions, and paradoxically, this made her even more attractive as a potential bride for Protestant rulers seeking wives who would not bring religious complications into their marriages. As 1704 drew to a close, Caroline had reached a crucial juncture in her life. At 21, she had been thoroughly educated in both the intellectual and practical arts necessary for success in the highest levels of European society. She had demonstrated her independence of mind and strength of character. Most importantly, she had developed the analytical and political skills that would later make her one of the most influential queens in British history. But all of this was still potential rather than achievement. Caroline needed a stage worthy of her talents, a situation where her remarkable abilities could be fully utilized. That stage was about to be provided by a visit from a young prince who would prove to be her perfect match in ambition, if not in intellectual gifts. Georg August, Electoral Prince of Hanover, the future King George II of Great Britain. The autumn of 1704 brought to Queen Sophia Charlotte's court at Luxembourg a visitor who would forever alter the trajectory of Caroline's life. Georg August, Electoral Prince of Hanover, had come to Berlin as part of a carefully orchestrated diplomatic visit, but his true purpose was far more personal. He was seeking a wife, and Caroline of Ansbach had been suggested as a potential candidate. Georg August was a young man of 21, the same age as Caroline, but their similarities ended there. Where Caroline possessed a brilliant mind that delighted in philosophical discourse, Georg August was primarily interested in military affairs and the practical business of governance. Where she had spent her adolescence in the rarefied intellectual atmosphere of Berlin, he had been raised in the more conventional environment of Hanover, focused on preparing him for his future role as a ruler, rather than as a thinker. Yet despite these differences in intellectual inclination, Georg August was by no means unintelligent. He possessed the practical wisdom that came from being raised to rule, understood the delicate balance of European politics, and had already demonstrated considerable courage in military campaigns. Perhaps more importantly, he had the wisdom to recognize intellectual superiority when he encountered it, and rather than feeling threatened by Caroline's learning, he found himself genuinely impressed by it. Their first meeting took place at one of Queen Sophia Charlotte's famous evening gatherings, where the conversation flowed as freely as the wine, and where topics ranged from the latest developments in natural philosophy to the complex diplomatic maneuverings of European powers. Caroline, now fully at ease in such gatherings after years of participation, held her own in discussions that would have intimidated most women of the period, displaying not only her learning, but also her ability to express complex ideas with clarity and grace. Georg August found himself captivated not just by Caroline's beauty, though she was undeniably lovely, but by the quality of her mind and the confidence with which she expressed her thoughts. Here was a woman who could discuss Leibniz's philosophy as easily as she could, comment on the latest court fashions, who could offer intelligent opinions on political developments while maintaining perfect social grace. For Caroline, Georg August represented something she had not previously encountered, a man who seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts and opinions, rather than simply her appearance and birth. He listened when she spoke, asked thoughtful questions, and demonstrated a respect for her intelligence that was all too rare among the young men of her acquaintance. Their courtship, conducted under the watchful and approving eye of Queen Sophia Charlotte, unfolded over several weeks of increasingly intimate conversations. They walked together in the palace gardens, discussing everything from poetry to politics, discovering a compatibility of temperament that surprised them both. Georg August found in Caroline a woman who could be both an intellectual companion and a supportive partner, while Caroline discovered in him a man who valued her mind as much as her beauty. The political implications of a potential marriage between them were not lost on either of their families. Georg August was the heir not only to the electorate of Hanover, but potentially to the British throne as well, since his grandmother, the Electress Sophia, had been named as Queen Anne's successor under the Act of Settlement. Caroline, as the ward of Queen Sophia Charlotte, and a princess of unimpeachable Protestant credentials, would make an ideal consort for a future King of Great Britain. But beyond the political calculations, there was genuine affection developing between the young couple. Caroline's letters from this period, preserved in various archives, reveal a young woman, both excited by the prospect of marriage and genuinely fond of her suitor. She wrote to Leibniz about Georg August, describing him as a man of good character and expressing her hope that their marriage would be both personally fulfilling and politically beneficial. Queen Sophia Charlotte, observing the developing romance with satisfaction, gave her full approval to the match. She had grown to love Caroline as a daughter, and wanted nothing more than to see her protégée well settled, with a husband who would appreciate her qualities. The Queen of Prussia also understood the political advantages of the alliance, strengthening the ties between Prussia and Hanover, at a time when European alliances were crucial for smaller German states. The formal engagement was announced in the spring of 1705, to general approval from both courts. The wedding was planned for late summer, giving both families time to arrange the elaborate ceremonies expected for such an important dynastic union. But perhaps more importantly, it gave Caroline and Georg August additional time to get to know one another, to build the foundation of trust and affection that would sustain their marriage through the many challenges that lay ahead. As the wedding date approached, Caroline found herself balancing excitement with a certain amount of trepidation. Marriage would mean leaving the intellectual sanctuary of Queen Sophia, Charlotte's court, for the more conventional environment of Hanover. It would mean taking on the responsibilities of a future queen, with all the public duties and private sacrifices that such a role entailed. Most significantly, it would mean beginning a new chapter of her life, where her primary identity would be as a wife and hopefully mother, rather than as the brilliant student and protégée she had been in Berlin. Queen Sophia Charlotte, recognizing Caroline's concerns, spent long hours preparing her ward for the realities of married life and royal responsibilities. She emphasized that Caroline's intellectual gifts were not something to be hidden or abandoned after marriage, but rather tools that could be used to serve her new family and future subjects. The Queen encouraged Caroline to see her role as Georg August's wife, not as a limitation, but as an opportunity to exercise influence on a much larger stage. The wedding ceremony itself took place on August 22nd, 1705, at the chapel of Herrenhausen Palace near Hanover. It was a magnificent affair, with representatives from courts throughout Protestant Europe in attendance. Caroline, wearing a gown of ivory silk embroidered with silver threads and adorned with the finest diamonds from the Hanoverian treasury, looked every inch the radiant bride. Georg August, resplendent in his military uniform with the insignia of his various orders, appeared every inch the proud bridegroom. But beyond the pomp and ceremony, there was genuine emotion in the vows exchanged between the young couple. Those who observed them closely noted the obvious affection in their eyes, the way they smiled at each other during the service, and the tenderness with which they conducted themselves throughout the wedding celebrations. This was clearly a marriage that had begun with genuine feeling, not merely political convenience. The early months of their marriage were spent at Herrenhausen, where Caroline was gradually introduced to the routines and responsibilities of her new life. She quickly won the affection of Georg August's grandmother, the Electress Sophia, who had been somewhat concerned about welcoming another strong-minded woman into a household that already contained its share of forceful personalities. But Sophia found in Caroline not a rival, but a kindred spirit, someone who shared her love of learning and her understanding of political realities. Caroline's relationship with her new father-in-law, the Elector Georg Ludwig, was more complex. He was a man of traditional views who was somewhat skeptical of learned women, but he could not deny Caroline's obvious intelligence and her positive influence on his son. More importantly, he recognized that her Protestant credentials and her connection to the Prussian court made her a valuable political asset for the House of Hanover. The newlyweds established a comfortable routine at Herrenhausen, with Caroline gradually adapting to the more formal protocols of Hanoverian court life, while Georg August discovered new depths to his wife's character. Their intellectual conversations continued, though Caroline learned to adapt her approach to Georg August's more practical mindset, discussing philosophical concepts in terms of their potential applications rather than their abstract beauty. The first test of their marriage came sooner than anyone might have expected. In January 1707, just 5 months after their wedding, Caroline gave birth to their first child, a son they named Frederick Louis. The birth was difficult, but Caroline recovered well, and the arrival of a healthy heir was cause for celebration throughout Hanover and beyond. However, joy soon turned to anxiety when, just a few months after Frederick's birth, Caroline fell seriously ill with smallpox, the same disease that had claimed her father and stepfather. The illness was severe, and for several terrifying weeks, it appeared that Caroline might not survive. Georg August, demonstrating the depth of his devotion, refused to leave his wife's side despite the risk of contagion, personally nursing her through the worst of the crisis. This period of illness proved to be a crucial test of their marriage. Georg August's willingness to risk his own life to care for Caroline demonstrated his genuine love for her, while Caroline's gratitude for his devotion deepened her own affection for him. When she finally recovered, though bearing some scarring from the disease, their bond had been strengthened rather than weakened by the ordeal. The smallpox episode had another significant consequence. Georg August himself contracted the disease while caring for Caroline, though his case proved to be much milder. This shared experience of illness created an additional bond between them, a sense that they had faced a life-threatening crisis together and emerged stronger for it. With Caroline's recovery and the successful birth of their first child, the young couple could finally begin to plan for their future with confidence. They established themselves as a formidable partnership, with Georg August handling the more traditional aspects of court life, while Caroline increasingly involved herself in the intellectual and cultural activities that would define her later queenship. The years following Frederick's birth saw Caroline settling more fully into her role as a Hanoverian princess, while simultaneously maintaining the intellectual interests that had been nurtured during her youth in Berlin. She continued her correspondence with Leibniz, who remained fascinated by her development and often sought her opinions on various philosophical questions. These letters provide a wonderful glimpse into Caroline's evolving thought processes as she balanced the demands of motherhood and royal duty with her ongoing commitment to learning. Caroline also began to establish her own salon at Herrenhausen, modelled after Queen Sophia Charlotte's gatherings in Berlin, but adapted to the different character of Hanoverian society. These evening assemblies attracted the most intelligent and cultured members of the court, creating a space where ideas could be discussed freely and where Caroline could continue to develop her skills as a hostess and intellectual facilitator. During these years, Caroline and Georg August's family continued to grow. Princess Anne Sophie was born in 1709, followed by Princess Amelia Sophia in 1711, and Princess Caroline Elizabeth in 1713. Each birth strengthened Caroline's position at court, while also demonstrating her ability to fulfill the primary duty expected of royal wives, providing heirs for the succession. But even as she embraced her role as a mother, Caroline never abandoned her intellectual pursuits. She ensured that her children, including her daughters, received excellent educations, and she continued to participate in the scholarly discussions that made the Hanoverian court one of the more intellectually vibrant in Germany. By 1714, Caroline had been married to Georg August for 9 years, during which time she had successfully adapted to her role as a Hanoverian princess, while maintaining her distinctive intellectual identity. She had proven herself capable of managing the complex social dynamics of court life, had established herself as a devoted wife and mother, and had begun to develop the political skills that would later make her one of the most influential queens in British history. Little did she know that within months, a dramatic change in her circumstances would test all of these abilities to their utmost, as the death of Queen Anne of Great Britain would transform her from a German electoral princess into the Princess of Wales, setting the stage for one of the most remarkable careers in royal history. The summer of 1714 brought news that would transform not only Caroline's life, but the entire trajectory of British history. Queen Anne of Great Britain had died childless on August 1st, and in accordance with the Act of Settlement of 1701, the British crown had passed to Georg Ludwig, Elector of Hanover, Caroline's father-in-law, who now became King George I of Great Britain and Ireland. The implications of this dramatic change were immediately apparent to Caroline, whose sharp political mind quickly grasped both the opportunities and challenges that lay ahead. Her husband, Georg August, was now heir to the British throne and Prince of Wales, while she herself had become Princess of Wales, the highest-ranking female in the British royal family since the new king had no wife. The transformation from German electoral princess to British Princess of Wales required Caroline to undertake the only sea voyage of her life, crossing the English Channel in October 1714 to take up residence in her new kingdom. The journey was uncomfortable and anxiety-provoking for someone who had never before left the familiar territories of Germany. But Caroline approached it with characteristic determination to master whatever challenges awaited her. London in 1714 was a city unlike anything Caroline had previously experienced. With a population approaching 500,000, it was one of the largest cities in Europe, a bustling commercial centre where merchants and aristocrats, intellectuals and artisans all mingled in a social complexity that both fascinated and challenged her. The court at St. James's Palace was far more formal and protocol-driven than the relatively intimate atmosphere she had known at Herrenhausen, requiring her to quickly master new social rituals while establishing her position in an established hierarchy. Caroline's first months in London were dedicated to understanding the unique characteristics of British court life and society. She had to learn not only new protocols, but also to navigate the complex relationships between the royal family and the established British aristocracy, many of whom viewed the Hanoverian succession with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Her intelligence and adaptability served her well during this period as she gradually built relationships with key figures while carefully observing the political currents that flowed beneath the surface of court life. One of Caroline's most significant early relationships was with Sir Robert Walpole, a rising politician who had served in various government positions and who possessed exactly the kind of practical political intelligence that Caroline found both fascinating and useful. Walpole quickly recognized Caroline's exceptional abilities and began to cultivate a friendship that would prove crucial for both of their futures. Their early conversations revealed to Caroline the intricacies of British parliamentary government, so different from the more autocratic systems she had known in Germany. However, the promising beginning of Caroline's British career was dramatically interrupted by a family crisis that would define much of her early experience as Princess of Wales. The relationship between King George I and his son, Prince Georg August, had been strained for years, rooted in personal conflicts that went back to Georg August's childhood, and had been exacerbated by fundamental differences in personality and approach to governance. The situation came to a head in 1717 over what might have seemed a trivial matter, but which, in the context of royal protocol, assumed enormous significance. The christening of Prince Georg Wilhelm, Caroline and Georg August's newborn son, became the occasion for a family quarrel that would split the royal household and have profound implications for Caroline's position and influence. The dispute arose when King George I insisted on choosing the godfather for his grandson, selecting the Duke of Newcastle, a choice that Prince Georg August found personally offensive. The prince's public objection to his father's decision delivered in terms that the king considered disrespectful, resulted in a confrontation that quickly escalated beyond any reasonable proportion to the original disagreement. King George I's response was swift and devastating. He ordered his son and daughter-in-law to leave St. James's Palace immediately and never return while he lived. More cruelly still, he decreed that their 3 eldest daughters, Anne, Amelia, and Caroline, must remain at court under his guardianship, effectively separating parents from their children as part of his punishment. For Caroline, this banishment was both personally devastating and politically challenging. The separation from her daughters caused her enormous anguish, as she was allowed to see them only briefly and under severely restricted circumstances. The 3 little girls, aged 8, 6, and 4 respectively, were suddenly deprived of their mother's daily care and affection, at a time when such separation could cause lasting emotional damage. But Caroline, characteristically, refused to allow personal tragedy to completely overwhelm her sense of purpose. If she and Georg August were to be excluded from the official court, she would create an alternative court that might actually prove more influential than the formal one. She set about transforming Leicester House, their new London residence, into a centre of political and intellectual activity that would attract all those who felt excluded from or dissatisfied with King George I's court. Leicester House quickly became known as the most interesting residence in London, where political discussions flowed as freely as wine, and where Caroline's exceptional conversational abilities made her the centre of attention among politicians, writers, artists, and intellectuals. Her salon attracted figures like Walpole during his periods out of government favour, opposition politicians seeking an alternative to the king's policies, and literary figures who found Caroline's informed interest in their work both flattering and practically useful. This period of exile from the official court allowed Caroline to develop skills that would prove invaluable throughout her later career. She learned to manage competing political factions, to maintain her dignity while operating from a position of official powerlessness, and to use her intellectual gifts as tools of political influence. The Leicester House Court became a gathering place for some of the most brilliant minds of the age. Writers like Alexander Pope and John Gay found welcome there, as did philosophers, scientists, and political theorists who appreciated Caroline's to engage with their ideas at a sophisticated level. These gatherings served multiple purposes. They established Caroline's reputation as a patron of learning and culture. They provided a forum for political opposition to organize and develop alternative policies, and they allowed Caroline to build a network of relationships that would serve her throughout her career. Caroline's approach to hosting these gatherings revealed her remarkable ability to balance competing interests and personalities. She could moderate discussions between politicians with fundamentally opposed views, encourage shy intellectuals to share their insights, and ensure that even the most heated debates remained within the bounds of civilized discourse. Her talent for making each guest feel valued and heard made Leicester House a destination that even those loyal to King George I sometimes found difficult to resist. During this period of exile, Caroline also demonstrated her remarkable emotional resilience. The separation from her daughters was a constant source of pain, but she channeled her maternal energy into caring for her younger children who remained with her, Prince William and the infant Prince George. She was determined that her domestic difficulties would not prevent her from providing excellent care and education for the children she could influence. The education Caroline provided for her younger children during the Leicester House years reflected her own intellectual development and her vision of what royal children should learn. She ensured they received instruction not only in traditional subjects like languages, history, and mathematics, but also in natural philosophy, theology, and the arts. She wanted them to be prepared for whatever roles destiny might assign them. Whether those roles involved governing kingdoms or simply living as informed, thoughtful individuals, Caroline's correspondence with Leibniz continued throughout this period of family crisis, providing her with an intellectual outlet and helping her maintain perspective on her difficulties. The great philosopher, now elderly but still mentally vigorous, offered both practical advice and philosophical comfort, reminding Caroline that temporary setbacks often serve to strengthen character and prepare individuals for greater challenges ahead. The political situation created by the royal family's split had serious implications for the stability of the Hanoverian dynasty. Having the heir to the throne in open conflict with the reigning monarch created opportunities for Jacobite plotters who sought to restore the Stuart dynasty to the British throne. Caroline understood these implications clearly and began to work quietly behind the scenes to bring about a reconciliation that would serve the broader interests of the dynasty, even if it required personal sacrifice. Her efforts at reconciliation were complicated by her husband's pride and his father's stubbornness, but Caroline possessed exactly the combination of patience, intelligence, and political skill necessary for such delicate negotiations. She began to cultivate relationships with individuals who had influence with King George I, using her charm and intelligence to gradually build support for the idea that the royal family's reconciliation was essential for political stability. Robert Walpole proved to be a crucial ally in these efforts. He had served in King George I's government, but had fallen from favour over policy disagreements, giving him both understanding of the official court and sympathy for those excluded from it. Walpole recognised that Caroline's intelligence and political instincts made her potentially valuable as an ally, while Caroline saw in Walpole exactly the kind of practical politician who could help bridge the gap between the competing factions within the royal family. Their collaboration during the Leicester House years established patterns of cooperation that would later prove crucial to the success of both their careers. Walpole provided Caroline with detailed information about parliamentary politics and the practical business of governance, while Caroline offered Walpole access to the future king and queen and the opportunity to position himself favourably for the eventual succession. The Leicester House court also served as Caroline's introduction to the unique characteristics of British intellectual and cultural life. Unlike the German courts she had known, London's society included a significant number of wealthy merchants, successful professionals, and self-made intellectuals who had achieved prominence through talent rather than birth. Caroline's ability to recognize and appreciate merit regardless of social origin would later serve her well as queen, helping her build support among the emerging middle classes who were becoming increasingly important in British society. During these years of exile, Caroline also began to develop her understanding of British religious and theological questions, which were far more complex and politically significant than the relatively straightforward Lutheranism she had known in Germany. The Church of England's position as the established church, the existence of significant Catholic and dissenting minorities, and the ongoing theological debates within Anglicanism itself all required careful navigation by members of the royal family. Caroline approached these religious complexities with characteristic intelligence and caution. She maintained her Protestant credentials while demonstrating tolerance for different approaches to Christian faith, a position that helped her build bridges across some of the religious divisions that complicated British politics. Her theological sophistication, developed through her correspondence with Leibniz and her years in Queen Sophia Charlotte's intellectually diverse court, proved valuable in navigating these sensitive issues. The Leicester House years also revealed Caroline's exceptional ability to manage public opinion and her image. Despite being officially excluded from court, she maintained a positive public reputation through careful attention to charitable activities, cultural patronage, and public appearances that demonstrated her commitment to her adopted country. She understood intuitively that popular support could be as valuable as official recognition, and she worked systematically to build relationships with ordinary British subjects. Caroline's patronage of the arts during this period established her reputation as someone who genuinely appreciated cultural achievement rather than merely using artistic support for political purposes. She provided support for musicians, writers, and artists, not because they could serve her political interests, but because she recognized their talent and wanted to encourage excellence. This genuine appreciation for artistic merit helped her build authentic relationships within London's cultural community. By 1720, Caroline had spent 3 years transforming what could have been a period of humiliating exile into an opportunity for political and personal growth. She had established Leicester House as a genuine alternative to the official court, had built relationships with key political and cultural figures, and had demonstrated her ability to maintain dignity and purpose in difficult circumstances. Most importantly, she had begun to build the foundation for the eventual reconciliation that would restore her family to official favour. The reconciliation, when it finally came in 1720, was largely the result of Caroline's patient diplomatic work combined with the practical political necessities recognised by more pragmatic courtiers on both sides of the family divide. The immediate catalyst was the South Sea Bubble crisis, which required the royal family to present a united front during a period of significant political and economic instability. Caroline's role in negotiating the reconciliation was typically subtle but crucial. She worked through intermediaries to communicate the family's willingness to make the necessary ceremonial gestures of submission, while ensuring that the eventual agreement would not require genuine humiliation. Her ability to find face-saving solutions for all parties involved demonstrated the diplomatic skills that would later make her such an effective queen. The formal reconciliation ceremony took place at St. James's Palace in April 1720, with Caroline and Georg August publicly acknowledging King George III's authority, while the king graciously welcomed them back to court. For Caroline, the most emotional moment came when she was finally reunited with her 3 eldest daughters, who had spent 3 crucial years of their childhood separated from their mother's daily care. However, the reconciliation, while politically necessary, did not entirely repair the emotional damage caused by the long estrangement. Caroline's relationship with her eldest daughters had been affected by their separation, and she had to work carefully to rebuild the bonds that had been disrupted during their years apart. The experience left her with a deep understanding of how political conflicts could damage family relationships, a lesson she would remember during her own later conflicts with her son Frederick. The immediate aftermath of the reconciliation saw Caroline working to consolidate the gains she had made during the Leicester House years, while adapting to the different requirements of life within the official court structure. She had to balance her loyalty to the friends and allies she had cultivated during her exile with the need to rebuild relationships within the established court hierarchy. One of Caroline's most important achievements during this transitional period was maintaining her relationship with Robert Walpole, who was also working his way back into official favour. Their friendship, forged during the shared experience of exile from court, would prove to be one of the most significant political partnerships of the 18th century, though its full importance would not become apparent until Caroline became queen. The reconciliation also provided Caroline with the opportunity to demonstrate her growth and maturity to King George I, who gradually came to appreciate his daughter-in-law's intelligence and political skills. While their relationship never became warm, it developed into one of mutual respect, with the king recognizing that Caroline's abilities would be valuable assets to the Hanoverian dynasty. By the end of 1720, Caroline had successfully navigated the most challenging period of her life as Princess of Wales. emerging with enhanced political skills, a broader network of relationships, and a deeper understanding of British society and politics. The Leicester House years had been difficult personally, but invaluable professionally, providing her with exactly the kind of experience she would need when she eventually became queen. Most importantly, they had revealed to everyone who observed her carefully that Caroline possessed the rare combination of intelligence, determination, and political instinct that marked truly exceptional leaders. The morning of June 11th, 1727, dawned with no unusual portents, yet it would prove to be one of the most significant days in Caroline's life and in the history of the British monarchy. King George I, while travelling to his beloved Hanover, had suffered a stroke and died at Osnabrück, making Caroline's husband King George II and transforming her from Princess of Wales into Queen Consort of Great Britain and Ireland. The news of the King's death reached London on June 15th, delivered by Sir Robert Walpole himself, who had rushed back from Hanover to manage the transition of power. Caroline received the momentous news at Richmond Lodge, where she and George II had been enjoying a period of relative domestic tranquility. The moment she learned of her father-in-law's death, Caroline understood that her life had fundamentally changed once again. But this time, the change brought with it opportunities for influence and power beyond anything she had previously imagined. George II's first instinct as the new monarch was to dismiss Walpole from his position as First Lord of the Treasury, a decision that reflected the lingering tensions from their years of conflict during the Leicester House period. The new king favoured Sir Spencer Compton, the Speaker of the House of Commons, whom he perceived as more congenial and less politically challenging than the formidable Walpole. However, Caroline immediately recognised that this decision, while emotionally satisfying for her husband, would be politically disastrous for their reign. Walpole, despite his sometimes difficult personality, was unquestionably the most capable politician in the kingdom, with unparalleled understanding of parliamentary management and financial administration. More importantly, Caroline had come to trust Walpole's judgment during their years of friendship, and she understood that his skills would be essential for establishing their new reign on solid foundations. The crucial moment came when George II asked Compton to draft the new monarch's first speech to Parliament, a task that would normally fall to the Chief Minister. Compton, recognising his own limitations in such matters, privately approached Walpole for assistance with the speech, inadvertently revealing to Caroline the extent of his dependence on the very man the king wished to dismiss. Caroline seized upon this opportunity with characteristic political brilliance. Rather than directly challenging her husband's decision, which would have risked a confrontation that could damage their relationship, she began a subtle campaign to change his mind. She arranged for George II to see clear evidence of Compton's limitations while simultaneously highlighting Walpole's indispensable capabilities. The process by which Caroline convinced George II to retain Walpole revealed her extraordinary understanding of her husband's psychology and her remarkable skill in political manipulation. She never directly argued with the king's preferences, but instead created situations where he would reach the correct conclusions himself. She arranged conversations where Walpole's expertise became obvious, orchestrated encounters that revealed Compton's inadequacies, and gradually built the case for retaining the more capable minister without ever appearing to challenge royal prerogatives. Caroline's success in this crucial early test established patterns that would characterize her entire queenship. She had demonstrated her ability to influence major political decisions while maintaining the appearance of wifely submission, shown her capacity to manage her husband's pride while achieving her policy objectives, and proven her understanding of the complex relationship between royal authority and practical political effectiveness. Walpole's retention as chief minister was perhaps the most important single decision of George II's reign, and it was largely Caroline's achievement. The partnership between Caroline and the Walpole that emerged from this early crisis would dominate British politics for the next decade, creating a stability and continuity of governance that served both the Hanoverian dynasty and the British nation extraordinarily well. The early months of George II's reign also revealed Caroline's understanding of the symbolic and ceremonial aspects of queenship. She approached the coronation preparations with meticulous attention to detail, understanding that public ceremonies provided opportunities to communicate messages about the monarchy's values and priorities. The coronation itself, held at Westminster Abbey on October 11, 1727, was a magnificent spectacle that both honoured British traditions and subtly emphasised the legitimacy of the Hanoverian succession. Caroline's conduct during the coronation ceremony demonstrated her mastery of royal protocol, combined with genuine dignity and grace. Contemporary observers noted her composure throughout the lengthy ceremony, her appropriate responses to the various ritual elements, and her obvious emotional connection to the solemnity of the occasion. The coronation marked not only her official recognition as queen, but also her public presentation as someone worthy of that exalted position. However, the early period of George II's reign was not without its challenges for Caroline. The transition from Princess of Wales to Queen Consort required her to navigate new relationships with court officials, government ministers, and foreign diplomats who were assessing her influence and seeking to understand how power would be exercised in the new reign. Caroline approached these challenges with characteristic intelligence and caution. She avoided making dramatic changes to established court routines, while gradually implementing modifications that reflected her own priorities and preferences. She maintained ceremonial traditions, while introducing new elements that emphasize learning, culture, and intellectual achievement. Most importantly, she began to establish her own channels of communication and influence that would allow her to participate effectively in political decision-making. One of Caroline's most significant early achievements as queen was establishing her position as the most senior woman in the royal family and court hierarchy. Unlike many previous queens who had to compete with queen mothers or other female relatives for precedence and influence, Caroline's position was unchallenged, giving her exceptional opportunities to shape court culture and social expectations. Caroline used this position to promote values and activities that reflected her own intellectual interests and social priorities. She encouraged scholarly pursuits among courtiers, supported charitable activities that addressed social problems, and created an atmosphere at court where serious conversation and cultural achievement were valued alongside traditional aristocratic accomplishments. Her early relationship with Parliament also revealed Caroline's political sophistication. While Queen's Consort had no formal role in parliamentary proceedings, Caroline understood that successful governance required managing relationships between the Crown and the legislature. She worked closely with Walpole to ensure that royal policies were presented effectively to Parliament, while using her social position to build personal relationships with key parliamentary figures. The famous satirical verse that emerged during this period, "You may strut, dapper George, but 'twill all be in vain. We all know 'tis Queen. Caroline, not you, that reign," reflected public recognition of Caroline's unusual degree of influence over government policy. While such verses were typically intended as criticism, they actually served to enhance Caroline's reputation by acknowledging her exceptional abilities and political effectiveness. Caroline's management of her public image during these early years as queen revealed her sophisticated understanding of the relationship between monarchy and public opinion. She maintained the dignity and ceremony expected of a queen, while also demonstrating accessibility and concern for her subjects' welfare. Her charitable activities were genuine expressions of her social consciousness, but they also served to build popular support for the monarchy. The early years of George II's reign also saw Caroline beginning to exercise influence over church appointments, an area where her theological sophistication and commitment to religious tolerance proved particularly valuable. She worked to ensure that bishops and other senior clergy were selected for their learning and pastoral abilities, rather than merely their political connections, helping to maintain the Church of England's intellectual credibility during a period of theological ferment. Caroline's influence over religious appointments reflected her broader approach to governance, which emphasized merit and competence over personal loyalty or political convenience. She understood that the long-term success of the Hanoverian dynasty depended on effective governance, and she was willing to support capable individuals regardless of their personal relationship to the royal family. By 1730, Caroline had successfully established herself as one of the most influential queen consorts in British history. Her partnership with Walpole had created a stable and effective system of government. Her management of court culture had enhanced the monarchy's intellectual reputation, and her public activities had built popular support for the Hanoverian dynasty. Most importantly, she had demonstrated that it was possible for a queen consort to exercise significant political influence while maintaining the appearance of appropriate feminine deference to male authority. The period from 1727 to 1730 represented Caroline's transformation from a talented and ambitious princess into a queen of exceptional capability and influence. She had learned to navigate the complex requirements of British constitutional monarchy, had established working relationships with the key figures in government and society, and had begun to implement her vision of what monarchy could achieve when intelligence and political skill were combined with genuine concern for national welfare. The foundation Caroline laid during these crucial early years of George II's reign would support her influence throughout the remainder of her life and establish precedents that would influence the development of constitutional monarchy for generations to come. She had proven that a queen consort could be far more than a ceremonial figure, demonstrating instead that such a position could serve as a platform for genuine political leadership when occupied by someone with the necessary abilities and determination. The decade of the 1730s marked the zenith of Caroline's political influence, a period during which she operated as the unofficial but undisputed power behind the British throne. Her partnership with Sir Robert Walpole had by this time evolved into one of the most effective political collaborations in British history, with Caroline serving as the crucial link between the practical necessities of parliamentary governance and the personal authority of the crown. Caroline's method of exercising power was subtle but extraordinarily effective. She never challenged the constitutional principle that ultimate authority rested with the king, but she had developed such mastery over George II's decision-making process that her preferences became royal policy with remarkable consistency. Her technique was to present issues to the king in ways that made her preferred solutions appear to be his own insights, allowing him to maintain his masculine pride while ensuring that government policy reflected her superior political judgment. This arrangement worked because Caroline understood her husband's character perfectly. George II was intelligent enough to recognize good advice when he heard it, but his pride required that he appear to be the source of the important decisions. Caroline's genius lay in her ability to provide him with excellent guidance while allowing him to take credit for the results, creating a partnership that satisfied both his ego and the nation's need for effective leadership. The most visible manifestation of Caroline's political influence was her role during George II's frequent absences from England. Between 1729 and 1737, she served as regent 4 separate times when the king travelled to Hanover. and these regencies provided clear demonstrations of her political capabilities. Unlike many regencies that were merely ceremonial positions held by individuals with limited actual authority, Caroline's regencies involved real responsibility for governing the kingdom, making crucial decisions, and managing both domestic and international crises. Her first regency, from May to November 1729, established the pattern for her later exercises of temporary royal authority. Rather than simply maintaining existing policies during the king's absence, Caroline used her regencies as opportunities to advance important initiatives and address pressing problems that might have been neglected during normal times. She understood that her temporary authority, while limited in duration, could be used to achieve lasting improvements in governance and policy. During the 1729 Regency, Caroline successfully managed the delicate negotiations that led to the Treaty of Seville, which resolved tensions between Britain and Spain that had threatened to escalate into open warfare. The diplomatic success was achieved through Caroline's careful attention to the complex balance of European power relationships and her ability to identify solutions that served British interests while allowing other parties to maintain their dignity. The Treaty of Seville negotiations revealed Caroline's exceptional grasp of international affairs and her ability to think strategically about Britain's long-term interests. She understood that military conflicts were expensive and disruptive, and that diplomatic solutions were preferable whenever they could be achieved without compromising essential national interests. Her success in avoiding war while protecting British commercial interests demonstrated the practical benefits of her approach to governance. Caroline's second regency, from May to September 1732, was marked by her investigation into widespread abuses in the British penal system, an initiative that reflected both her personal commitment to social justice and her understanding that effective governance required attention to domestic as well as international affairs. The investigation revealed shocking conditions in prisons throughout the kingdom, including evidence of corruption, cruelty, and systematic neglect of prisoners' basic needs. While Caroline was not able to implement all the reforms she would have preferred, Walpole proved reluctant to pursue comprehensive prison reform due to its potential political costs. Her investigation led to significant improvements in prison conditions and established important precedents for government oversight of correctional institutions. Her work in this area demonstrated her commitment to using royal authority to protect society's most vulnerable members. The prison investigation also revealed Caroline's sophisticated understanding of the relationship between social conditions and political stability. She recognized that widespread injustice and abuse could undermine public confidence in government institutions, and that addressing such problems was not merely a matter of moral obligation, but of practical political necessity. Caroline's third regency, in 1735, coincided with one of the most serious political crises of George II's reign, the excise crisis of 1733, which continued to have political repercussions 2 years later. Walpole's proposal to extend excise taxation to wine and tobacco had generated such intense opposition that it threatened to bring down his government, and Caroline played a crucial role in helping him navigate the political challenges created by this controversy. The excise crisis tested Caroline's political skills to their utmost, as she had to balance her support for Walpole with the need to maintain the monarchy's reputation for responding to legitimate public concerns. Her approach was characteristically nuanced. She supported the underlying fiscal policy, while working behind the scenes to modify its implementation in ways that address the most serious objections raised by critics. Caroline's management of the excise crisis demonstrated her understanding that effective political leadership sometimes required tactical retreats in service of strategic objectives. While she personally believed that Walpole's excise proposals were sound fiscal policy, She recognized that their political costs might outweigh their economic benefits, and she supported the decision to withdraw the most controversial elements of the plan. Her fourth and final regency, in 1736, occurred during a period of particular international tension, with various European powers maneuvering for advantage in what would eventually become the War of Austrian Succession. Caroline's handling of foreign policy during this regency revealed her sophisticated understanding of the complex balance of power that maintained European stability. Throughout all four of her regencies, Caroline maintained careful correspondence with George II in Hanover, keeping him informed of developments while ensuring that her decisions had his retroactive approval. This correspondence reveals Caroline's political intelligence and her careful attention to maintaining constitutional proprieties, even while exercising extensive practical authority. The regencies also provided opportunities for Caroline to demonstrate her administrative capabilities to a broader audience of political figures who might not otherwise have observed her abilities closely. Ministers, parliamentarians, and foreign diplomats all had opportunities to work directly with Caroline during these periods, and their consistently positive assessments contributed significantly to her growing reputation as an exceptionally capable political leader. Between her formal regencies, Caroline continued to exercise significant influence over government policy through her daily interactions with George II and her regular consultations with Walpole. Their working relationship had evolved into a remarkably efficient system for developing and implementing policy, with Caroline serving as the crucial intermediary between Walpole's parliamentary and administrative expertise and the King's constitutional authority. Caroline's influence extended beyond high policy to include significant control over government appointments, particularly in areas where her expertise was recognized as superior to that of her male colleagues. Her role in church appointments was particularly important, as she used her theological knowledge and commitment to religious tolerance to ensure that positions in the Church of England were filled by individuals who combined scholarly ability with pastoral effectiveness. Her appointments policy in religious matters reflected Caroline's broader understanding of the relationship between government effectiveness and merit-based selection. She believed that important positions should be filled by the most qualified individuals available, regardless of their personal connections to the royal family or political establishment. This approach helped ensure that British religious institutions maintained intellectual credibility during a period of significant theological and philosophical ferment. Caroline's influence over secular appointments was more limited, but still significant in areas where her judgment was particularly valued. She played important roles in selecting tutors and advisors for the royal children, choosing individuals who combined practical competence with intellectual distinction. Her appointment decisions in this area reflected her commitment to providing excellent education for future generations of the royal family. The 1730s also saw Caroline developing her expertise in economic and financial policy, areas where her mathematical abilities and analytical intelligence proved particularly valuable. She worked closely with Walpole to understand the complex relationships between taxation, government borrowing, and economic growth, developing insights that contributed to the generally sound fiscal policies that characterized their collaboration. Caroline's interest in economic policy reflected her understanding that financial stability was essential for political stability, and that effective governance required careful attention to the practical mechanisms by which governments funded their activities. Her support for Walpole's generally prudent financial policies helped establish Britain's reputation for fiscal responsibility, which would prove valuable during later periods of international conflict. By the mid-1730s, Caroline had established herself as the most politically influential queen consort in British history, with her authority recognized by politicians, diplomats, and the general public alike. Her success in this unprecedented role reflected not only her exceptional personal abilities, but also her sophisticated understanding of the constraints and opportunities created by Britain's unique constitutional system. Caroline's political genius lay not in challenging existing constitutional arrangements, but in finding ways to exercise maximum influence within established frameworks. She never sought formal political power for herself, understanding that such ambitions would generate opposition and ultimately prove counterproductive. Instead, she focused on achieving substantive policy objectives through influence over those who did possess formal authority. The effectiveness of Caroline's approach was demonstrated by its durability and its acceptance by other political figures. Even those who disagreed with specific policies or decisions generally acknowledged her right to influence government affairs, recognizing that her involvement improved rather than hindered effective governance. This broad acceptance of her political role reflected both her personal capabilities and her careful attention to maintaining appropriate relationships with all the key figures in British political life. Throughout her reign as Queen Consort, Caroline never abandoned the intellectual passions that had been nurtured during her youth in Berlin under the guidance of Queen Sophia Charlotte. Instead, she transformed her position as Queen of Great Britain into a platform for promoting Enlightenment ideals and supporting the advancement of knowledge throughout her adopted kingdom. Her court became a centre of learning and cultural achievement that attracted scholars, artists, and thinkers from across Europe. Caroline's approach to intellectual patronage was both systematic and personally engaged. Unlike many royal patrons who provided financial support for cultural activities without deep personal involvement, Caroline maintained active intellectual relationships with the scholars and artists she supported. She read their works, engaged in meaningful conversations about their ideas, and provided thoughtful feedback that demonstrated her genuine understanding of their achievements. Her correspondence with Voltaire exemplified this approach to intellectual patronage. The great French philosopher, who spent several years in England during the 1720s, developed a deep admiration for Caroline's intelligence and learning. In his letters, Voltaire praised her as a benevolent philosopher, recognizing not only her support for philosophical inquiry, but also her personal contribution to intellectual discourse. Voltaire's assessment of Caroline was based on extensive personal interaction, rather than mere courtly flattery. He had participated in the philosophical discussions that Caroline hosted at court, had observed her ability to engage with complex ideas, and had witnessed her genuine commitment to advancing human knowledge. His praise carried particular weight because of his reputation for intellectual honesty and his willingness to criticize even powerful figures when he found their understanding wanting. The relationship between Caroline and Voltaire also reflected her commitment to international intellectual exchange. She understood that scholarship and learning transcended national boundaries, and she actively promoted communication between British thinkers and their counterparts in France, Germany, and other European countries. Her court served as a meeting place where scholars from different nations could exchange ideas and collaborate on projects of mutual interest. Caroline's most famous intellectual achievement was her role in mediating the correspondence between Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz and Samuel Clarke, a philosophical exchange that became one of the most important philosophical documents of the 18th century. This correspondence, which addressed fundamental questions about the nature of space, time, causation, and divine providence, might never have occurred without Caroline's initiative and continued involvement. The Leibniz-Clarke correspondence began when Caroline shared with Clarke some criticisms of Newtonian philosophy that Leibniz had included in a letter to her. Rather than simply passing along these criticisms, Caroline actively encouraged the ensuing debate, providing both philosophers with feedback and suggestions that helped clarify their arguments and identify the most important points of disagreement. Caroline's role in this correspondence went far beyond that of a mere intermediary. Her own philosophical understanding was sophisticated enough that she could follow the complex arguments being developed by both sides, and her interventions often helped focus the discussion on the most fundamental issues. The correspondence owes much of its clarity and philosophical significance to Caroline's active participation as both facilitator and intellectual contributor. The philosophical exchange also demonstrated Caroline's understanding of the political implications of intellectual debates. The dispute between Leibnizian and Newtonian physics had religious and political dimensions that Caroline navigated with characteristic skill, ensuring that the correspondence served to advance human knowledge while avoiding controversy that might have compromised the participants. Caroline's patronage of George Friedrich Handel represented another dimension of her cultural leadership, demonstrating her exceptional judgment in identifying and supporting artistic genius. Handel had come to England during the reign of George I, but it was Caroline's consistent support that enabled him to develop his distinctive style and create the masterworks that established his reputation as one of the greatest composers in history. The relationship between Caroline and Handel was based on genuine mutual respect and understanding. Caroline appreciated Handel's musical innovations and understood the significance of his artistic achievements, while Handel responded to her support by creating works that reflected both his own genius and her sophisticated aesthetic preferences. Their collaboration produced some of the most magnificent ceremonial music in the English tradition. Caroline's support for Handel extended beyond commissioning specific works to include providing him with the social and financial security necessary for sustained artistic creation. She ensured that he received regular income from court appointments, helped him secure subscriptions for his operas and oratorios, and used her influence to promote attendance at his performances. The musical culture that Caroline fostered at court had lasting influence on British artistic life. Her emphasis on excellence rather than mere entertainment elevated musical standards throughout the kingdom, while her support for innovative composers encouraged artistic experimentation and development. The tradition of royal patronage for serious music that Caroline established would influence British cultural life for generations. Caroline's creation and expansion of the Royal Library represented another important aspect of her intellectual patronage. She transformed what had been a modest collection of books into one of the finest libraries in Europe, acquiring works in multiple languages and covering the full range of contemporary knowledge. The library served not only her own scholarly interests, but also the needs of the many intellectuals who frequented her court. The Royal Library, under Caroline's direction, became a working research institution rather than merely a ceremonial collection. Scholars were encouraged to use its resources for their research, and Caroline often participated in discussions about new acquisitions and research projects. Her personal involvement in library development demonstrated her understanding that effective patronage required sustained attention and genuine commitment. Caroline's support for scientific research and medical advancement reflected her understanding that intellectual progress required practical application as well as theoretical development. She was particularly interested in medical innovations that could improve public health, and she used her position to promote the adoption of beneficial practices throughout the kingdom. Her most significant contribution to public health was her support for smallpox inoculation, a medical practice that she encountered through her correspondence with Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who had observed its use in Constantinople. Understanding both the potential benefits and the risks involved, Caroline arranged for careful trials of the technique before giving it her full endorsement. The trials Caroline organized were conducted with exemplary scientific rigor. She arranged for condemned prisoners to be offered inoculation as an alternative to execution, providing them with genuine choice while creating opportunities to observe the procedure's effects under controlled conditions. When these trials proved successful, she arranged for additional trials with orphan children, again ensuring that proper consent procedures were followed. Only after these careful trials had demonstrated the safety and effectiveness of inoculation did Caroline allow her own children to undergo the procedure. This decision required considerable courage, as she was risking her children's health based on a medical technique that was still regarded with suspicion by many physicians and members of the public. Caroline's promotion of smallpox inoculation saved thousands of lives throughout Britain and its colonies, establishing her as a significant figure in the history of public health. Her approach to this issue, combining careful scientific evaluation with courageous personal commitment, exemplified her general approach to using royal authority to advance human welfare. Her support for women's education represented another important dimension of Caroline's intellectual leadership. She believed that women possessed the same intellectual capabilities as men and should have opportunities to develop those capabilities through systematic education. While she could not directly challenge the social conventions that limited women's educational opportunities, she used her influence to expand access to learning whenever possible. Caroline's approach to promoting women's education was characteristically subtle but effective. She ensured that her own daughters received exceptional educations that included subjects typically reserved for male students. She supported female writers and intellectuals through her patronage, and she created social situations where educated women could demonstrate their abilities to influential audiences. The example of Caroline's own intellectual achievements served as powerful evidence for women's educational potential. Her philosophical sophistication, political wisdom, and cultural leadership demonstrated that women could excel in areas previously considered masculine domains when they were provided with appropriate opportunities for development. Caroline's vision of enlightened monarchy extended beyond intellectual and cultural patronage to include systematic efforts to improve social conditions throughout the kingdom. She understood that genuine progress required attention to the practical needs of ordinary subjects as well as support for elite intellectual activities. Her charitable activities were extensive and carefully planned, focusing on areas where royal intervention could achieve maximum benefit. She supported institutions that provided education for poor children, medical care for those unable to afford private treatment, and economic assistance for individuals and families facing temporary hardship. Caroline's approach to charity reflected her understanding of the relationship between individual assistance and systematic social reform. While she provided help for immediate needs, she also worked to address underlying conditions that created poverty and suffering, supporting initiatives that promised long-term improvements in social conditions. By the mid-1730s, Caroline had established herself as one of the most significant intellectual and cultural figures of her age, with her influence extending far beyond the traditional boundaries of queenly activity. Her court had become a center of Enlightenment culture that attracted visitors from throughout Europe, while her patronage had supported some of the most important artistic and intellectual achievements of the period. Caroline's success as an intellectual patron reflected her understanding that cultural leadership required sustained personal involvement rather than mere financial support. She invested her time, attention, and intelligence in the projects she supported, contributing to their success through her active participation rather than passive sponsorship. The intellectual and cultural achievements fostered by Caroline's patronage had lasting influence on British society, helping establish traditions of scholarly excellence and artistic achievement that would characterize the nation for generations. Her vision of monarchy as a force for intellectual and cultural progress provided a model that would influence royal patronage long after her death. No aspect of Caroline's life caused her greater anguish or revealed more starkly the personal costs of royal power than her relationship with her eldest son, Frederick, Prince of Wales. What began as natural maternal love gradually transformed into a bitter antagonism that would poison the royal family's domestic life and create political complications that lasted for generations. The roots of this tragic conflict lay in decisions made during Frederick's early childhood, when the complex dynamics of Hanoverian family politics created circumstances that would prove devastating for normal parent-child relationships. When George I became King of Great Britain in 1714, the decision was made to leave 7-year-old Frederick behind in Hanover, ostensibly to maintain a royal presence in the electorate, but actually reflecting the complicated relationships within the royal family. For Caroline, the separation from Frederick was initially understood as a temporary necessity, a brief sacrifice required by the demands of establishing the new dynasty in Britain. She could not have imagined that this temporary separation would stretch on for 14 years, depriving her of the opportunity to influence her son's character and values during the most crucial period of his development. The young Frederick, who remained in Hanover, was raised by tutors and courtiers who, while competent in their duties, could not provide the kind of nuanced guidance that would have prepared him for his eventual role as heir to the British throne. More significantly, he grew up without the moderating influence of his intelligent mother, who might have helped him develop the political wisdom and personal discipline necessary for successful royal leadership. During Frederick's absence, Caroline gave birth to several more children who remained with her in England, creating a situation where she developed close relationships with her younger children while becoming increasingly distant from her eldest son. Prince William, Princess Mary, and Princess Louisa all benefited from Caroline's daily attention and guidance, while Frederick remained a somewhat abstract figure in his mother's life, more an object of maternal worry than a real presence in her domestic routine. The psychological impact of this long separation affected both mother and son in ways that would prove impossible to repair. Caroline, despite her intellectual sophistication, could not overcome the natural resentment that developed toward a child who had been absent during the years when maternal bonds are typically strengthened. Frederick, for his part, grew up feeling abandoned by parents who had chosen political convenience over parental responsibility. When Frederick finally returned to England in December 1728, he was no longer the 7-year-old boy who had been left behind in Hanover, but a 21-year-old man with fully formed character traits, political opinions, and personal habits that his parents found deeply troubling. Caroline discovered that the son she had hoped to guide and influence had become a stranger whose values and behavior often contradicted everything she believed important. The adult Frederick who arrived in London was charming and intelligent, but he had also developed tendencies toward gambling, womanizing, and political opposition that immediately created friction with his parents. He had accumulated substantial debts in Hanover, had formed relationships with individuals whom Caroline considered unsuitable, and had developed political views that often contradicted those of his father's government. Perhaps most problematically, Frederick had learned to see political opposition as a natural role for the heir to the throne, following the pattern established by his father's conflicts with George I. But whereas George II's opposition to his father had been based on genuine political disagreements and had been moderated by Caroline's wisdom, Frederick's opposition often seemed motivated more by personal resentment than principled policy differences. Caroline's initial attempts to rebuild her relationship with Frederick were hampered by her inability to understand how profoundly the long separation had affected his psychological development. She approached him as if he was still the child she remembered, expecting him to respond to maternal guidance and correction, when in fact he was an adult who had learned to live without parental approval or oversight. The conflict was exacerbated by Caroline's obvious preference for her younger son, Prince William, who had been raised under her direct influence and had developed the kind of character traits that she valued. William was studious, dutiful, and respectful of his parents' wisdom, everything that Frederick seemed determined not to be. Caroline's contrast between her two sons, while perhaps unconscious, were obvious to everyone at court and served to deepen Frederick's resentment. Frederick's political opposition to his father's government created particular difficulties for Caroline, who found herself caught between her loyalty to Walpole's administration and her maternal desire to protect her son from the consequences of his political activities. She understood that Frederick's opposition was potentially damaging to the Hanoverian dynasty's stability, but she also recognized that direct confrontation might push him toward even more destructive behavior. The situation was complicated by Frederick's genuine political abilities, which made him an effective leader of parliamentary opposition, even when his motivations were questionable. He attracted support from politicians who were excluded from Walpole's government, from those who disagreed with specific policies, and from those who simply believed that healthy governance required vigorous opposition to ministerial power. Caroline's frustration with Frederick was intensified by her recognition that many of his criticisms of government policy were actually well-founded. His opposition to some of Walpole's foreign policy decisions, his concerns about the growing influence of Hanoverian interests in British politics, and his advocacy for increased attention to colonial affairs often reflected sophisticated political judgment rather than mere personal animosity. The personal dynamics of the mother-son conflict were further complicated by Frederick's relationships with women, which Caroline found both morally objectionable and politically dangerous. His various liaisons created scandal and gossip that reflected poorly on the royal family, while his failure to marry and produce legitimate heirs created uncertainty about the dynasty's future succession. Caroline's attempts to arrange a suitable marriage for Frederick became another source of conflict between them. She favored matches that would strengthen political alliances and bring capable women into the royal family, while Frederick resisted arrangements that he perceived as attempts to control his personal life. The extended negotiations over his eventual marriage to Princess Augusta of Saxe-Gotha reflected these competing priorities and preferences. When Frederick finally married Augusta in 1736, Caroline hoped that domestic responsibility might moderate his political opposition and personal excesses. However, marriage seemed to provide Frederick with additional motivation for opposition rather than reasons for reconciliation, as he sought to establish an independent household that could serve as an alternative center of political activity. The dramatic climax of the mother-son conflict came in July 1737, during Augusta's pregnancy with their first child. Frederick's decision to secretly remove his wife from Hampton Court Palace during labor, ensuring that his parents could not witness the birth, represented a deliberate rejection of royal protocols and a personal insult that Caroline found unforgivable. The circumstances of this incident revealed the depths of mistrust that had developed between Frederick and his parents. His fear that they might somehow interfere with the birth process, combined with his determination to exclude them from this important family moment, demonstrated how completely normal family relationships had broken down under the pressure of political and personal conflicts. Caroline's reaction to Frederick's behavior during Augusta's labor was one of absolute fury, made worse by her genuine concern for her daughter-in-law's welfare during a difficult birth process. The fact that Augusta had been forced to travel while in labor, risking both her own life and that of her child, struck Caroline as evidence of Frederick's fundamental selfishness and disregard for others' well-being. The famous quote attributed to Caroline after this incident, "Look, there he goes, that wretch, that villain. I wish the ground would open this moment and sink the monster to the lowest hole in hell," reflected the complete breakdown of maternal affection and the transformation of love into active hatred. While the authenticity of this specific quotation might be questioned, it accurately captured the intensity of Caroline's feelings toward her eldest son. The political implications of the family conflict extended far beyond personal relationships to affect the stability of the Hanoverian dynasty and the effectiveness of government policy. Frederick's opposition created a focal point for all those dissatisfied with George II's reign, while the royal family's internal divisions provided ammunition for Jacobite critics, who argued that the Hanoverians were unfit to rule Britain. Caroline understood these political implications clearly and worked to minimize the damage caused by the family conflict, but her personal antipathy toward Frederick made it impossible for her to pursue the kind of reconciliation that might have served the dynasty's broader interests. Her political wisdom, so evident in other areas, was compromised by the intensity of her maternal disappointment and anger. The tragedy of Caroline's relationship with Frederick was that both mother and son possessed genuine abilities that, under different circumstances, might have complemented each other effectively. Frederick's political instincts and popular appeal, combined with Caroline's intellectual depth and administrative experience, could have created a powerful partnership for advancing Hanoverian interests and British welfare. Instead, the long separation during Frederick's childhood, followed by years of accumulated misunderstandings and conflicts, created a dynamic where each family member's virtues seemed to intensify the other's shortcomings. Caroline's intelligence made Frederick's political opposition appear more foolish, while Frederick's charm and popular appeal highlighted Caroline's image as a controlling and manipulative figure. The personal cost of this conflict for Caroline was enormous, depriving her of the satisfaction that might have come from seeing her eldest son develop into an effective political leader and devoted family man. Instead of taking pride in Frederick's achievements, she found herself constantly worried about the damage his activities might cause to the dynasty's reputation and stability. The conflict also affected Caroline's relationships with her other children, as they were forced to navigate between loyalty to their mother and affection for their brother. The royal family's internal divisions created an atmosphere of tension and suspicion that made normal family interactions difficult and sometimes impossible. Frederick's exclusion from important family events, his parents' refusal to provide adequate financial support, and their obvious preference for his younger siblings created a pattern of estrangement that would influence royal family dynamics for generations. The precedent of heir-apparent opposition to reigning monarchs, established during George II's conflicts with George I and continued during Frederick's conflicts with George II, would plague the Hanoverian dynasty throughout its history. By 1737, the relationship between Caroline and Frederick had deteriorated beyond any possibility of genuine reconciliation. While formal courtesies might still be observed on public occasions, the fundamental trust and affection necessary for healthy family relationships had been permanently destroyed. This personal tragedy represented one of the most significant failures of Caroline's otherwise remarkably successful life, demonstrating that even exceptional intelligence and political skill could not overcome the psychological damage caused by prolonged family separation and accumulated misunderstandings. The Frederick conflict also revealed the limitations of Caroline's approach to human relationships, which worked extraordinarily well in political contexts, but proved inadequate for managing the complex emotions involved in mother-son relationships. Her ability to influence and manipulate political figures did not translate effectively to family dynamics, where genuine affection and emotional understanding were more important than strategic calculation. As Caroline entered the final months of her life in 1737, the unresolved conflict with Frederick remained a source of personal anguish and political concern. Her inability to repair this crucial relationship represented not only a personal failure, but also a threat to the dynasty's future stability, since Frederick would presumably inherit the throne and might use his position to reverse many of the policies and precedents that Caroline had worked so hard to establish. One of Caroline's most remarkable achievements as queen consort was her sophisticated management of George II's extramarital relationships, transforming what could have been sources of personal humiliation and political vulnerability into opportunities for maintaining and even enhancing her influence. Her approach to this delicate aspect of royal marriage revealed both her emotional maturity and her exceptional political intelligence. George II's infidelities were neither secret nor particularly scandalous by the standards of 18th century European royalty. Most kings maintained mistresses as a matter of course, and their wives were expected to tolerate these arrangements with dignified resignation. However, Caroline's response went far beyond mere tolerance, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of how extramarital relationships could be managed to serve rather than threaten her own interests. The most significant of George II's long-term relationships was with Henrietta Howard, a woman of modest birth but considerable intelligence and charm, who had served as one of Caroline's ladies-in-waiting since the early years of their marriage. The relationship between George II and Henrietta Howard began during the Leicester House period and continued for nearly 2 decades, making it far more than a casual liaison. Caroline's response to this relationship was strategically brilliant. Rather than treating Henrietta Howard as a rival or threat, Caroline maintained her in her household staff, eventually promoting her to the position of woman of the bedchamber and later mistress of the robes. This arrangement allowed Caroline to monitor the relationship closely while ensuring that Henrietta Howard remained dependent on royal favour for her position and income. The practical advantages of Caroline's approach became apparent over time. By keeping George II's primary mistress within her own household, Caroline could observe their interactions, influence their conversations, and ensure that Henrietta Howard's advice to the king was consistent with Caroline's own political objectives. Rather than allowing the mistress to operate independently and potentially develop her own political agenda, Caroline effectively incorporated her into the machinery of royal governance. Caroline's relationship with Henrietta Howard was complex, but fundamentally respectful. She recognized Howard's intelligence and personal qualities, appreciated her discretion in managing a delicate situation, and valued her loyalty to the royal family's interests. In return, Howard maintained appropriate deference to Caroline's superior position, while never attempting to challenge the Queen's authority or influence with the king. This arrangement worked because all 3 parties understood their respective roles and obligations. George II could maintain his relationship with Henrietta Howard without creating domestic conflicts that might affect his political effectiveness. Henrietta Howard could enjoy royal favour and financial security without risking her position through inappropriate ambitions. Caroline could maintain her marriage and political influence while demonstrating the kind of mature wisdom that enhanced rather than diminished her reputation. Caroline's tolerance of George II's infidelities was not passive resignation, but active management designed to serve her own interests and those of the dynasty. She understood that attempting to end her husband's extramarital relationships would likely prove unsuccessful, while creating conflicts that could damage both their marriage and his effectiveness as king. Instead, she chose to manage these relationships in ways that minimized their potential negative consequences, while maximizing opportunities for her own continued influence. The success of Caroline's approach was demonstrated by George II's continued dependence on her political advice and emotional support, despite his romantic involvement with other women. Unlike many royal marriages where extramarital relationships created permanent estrangement between spouses, Caroline and George II maintained an affectionate and productive partnership that served both personal and political needs. Caroline's management of court intrigue extended beyond her husband's romantic relationships to include the complex web of relationships, rivalries, and ambitions that characterized life at the royal court. Her position as queen consort required her to navigate between competing factions, manage conflicting personalities, and maintain stability within an institution that brought together individuals with diverse and often incompatible interests. The royal court during Caroline's time served multiple functions that created inherent tensions and conflicts. It was simultaneously a domestic household, a center of government administration, a focus of social activity for the aristocracy, and a symbol of royal authority and national dignity. These different functions required different approaches to management, and Caroline's success depended on her ability to balance competing demands and expectations. Caroline's approach to managing court intrigue was based on her understanding that most conflicts arose from competition for royal favor, access, and preferment, rather than fundamental disagreements about policy or principle. She worked to create systems for distributing opportunities and rewards that satisfied the legitimate ambitions of courtiers while preventing the kind of factional conflicts that could undermine royal authority. Her use of court appointments as tools of political management was particularly sophisticated. Rather than simply rewarding personal favorites or family connections, Caroline used appointments to build coalitions of support for royal policies, to manage relationships with important political figures, and to ensure that key positions were filled by individuals whose interests aligned with those of the dynasty. Caroline's management of relationships between different generations of courtiers was another important aspect of her court leadership. The royal court included both established figures who had served previous monarchs and younger individuals seeking to advance their careers under the new reign. Caroline worked to create opportunities for both groups while preventing the kind of generational conflicts that could fragment court society. Her approach to managing female courtiers was particularly important, given the limited opportunities available to women in 18th century society and the potential for jealousy and competition that characterized many court environments. Caroline used her position to create opportunities for capable women while ensuring that competition between them remained within acceptable bounds. The intellectual atmosphere that Caroline fostered at court served multiple purposes in managing intrigue and maintaining stability. By emphasizing learning, cultural achievement, and serious conversation, she created an environment where personal merit and intellectual contribution were valued alongside traditional markers of status and influence. Caroline's court became known throughout Europe for the quality of its intellectual and cultural activities, attracting visitors who came to participate in philosophical discussions, musical performances, and artistic exhibitions, rather than merely to seek political favor or social advancement. This reputation enhanced Britain's international prestige, while providing Caroline with opportunities to build relationships with influential figures from other countries. The patronage system that Caroline developed served as an effective tool for managing court relationships and maintaining loyalty among key supporters. Her support for writers, artists, musicians, and scholars created networks of obligation and gratitude that extended far beyond the immediate royal household, helping to build broader support for the Hanoverian dynasty among intellectual and cultural communities. Caroline's use of ceremonial occasions to reinforce court hierarchy and manage relationships was another important aspect of her leadership. Royal ceremonies provided opportunities to recognize achievement, reward loyalty, and demonstrate the monarchy's values and priorities. Caroline's careful attention to protocol and precedence during these occasions helped maintain order while creating opportunities for advancement and recognition. Her management of information flow within the court was crucial for preventing the kind of misunderstandings and rumors that could create unnecessary conflicts. Caroline maintained networks of trusted individuals who kept her informed about developing issues while ensuring that accurate information about royal policies and intentions was available to those who needed it. The seasonal rhythms of court life provided Caroline with opportunities to manage relationships and maintain stability through carefully planned social activities. The movement between different royal residences, the organization of hunting parties and other recreational activities, and the management of visiting schedules all required careful coordination to ensure that competing factions had appropriate access to royal attention. Caroline's approach to managing court finances and expenditures served both practical and political purposes. By maintaining careful control over court spending while ensuring that appropriate levels of magnificence were maintained, she balanced fiscal responsibility with the need to maintain royal dignity and provide opportunities for patronage and reward. Her relationship with foreign diplomats and visitors required particular skill, as these individuals often brought their own political agendas and sought to influence British policy through court relationships. Caroline's ability to provide appropriate hospitality while maintaining British interests required sophisticated understanding of international politics and diplomatic protocol. The success of Caroline's court management was demonstrated by the relative stability and effectiveness that characterized George II's reign, particularly during the years when her influence was at its peak. Unlike many royal courts that were plagued by factional conflicts, scandals, and administrative chaos, Caroline's court functioned as an effective instrument of governance while maintaining its role as a center of cultural and social activity. Caroline's approach to managing the complex dynamics of court life provided a model for future queens consort, while demonstrating the possibilities for effective female leadership within traditional monarchical systems. Her success proved that intelligence, political skill, and emotional maturity could overcome the inherent limitations of positions that were formally subordinate to male authority. By the mid-1730s, Caroline had established herself as one of the most effective court managers in European history, creating systems and precedents that would influence royal governance for generations to come. Her ability to balance competing interests, manage complex personalities, and maintain stability within a challenging institutional environment represented one of her most significant contributions to the success of the Hanoverian dynasty. Caroline's commitment to advancing opportunities for women represented one of the most progressive aspects of her reign, reflecting both her personal convictions and her sophisticated understanding of how social progress could serve broader political and economic interests. While she could not directly challenge the fundamental legal and social constraints that limited women's roles in 18th century society, she used her position to create opportunities, establish precedents, and demonstrate possibilities that would influence future generations. Her approach to promoting women's advancement was characteristically subtle but systematic, working within existing social frameworks while gradually expanding the boundaries of what was considered appropriate for women to achieve. Rather than confronting traditional attitudes directly, which would have generated opposition and likely proved counterproductive, Caroline demonstrated through her own example and her support for other women that traditional assumptions about female capabilities were both inaccurate and limiting. Caroline's most significant contribution to women's education was her insistence that her own daughters receive intellectual training equivalent to what would be provided for male heirs. Princess Anne, Princess Amelia, and Princess Caroline were all educated in classical languages, mathematics, natural philosophy, and theology, subjects typically reserved for male students, but which Caroline considered essential for any intelligent individual regardless of gender. The education provided for Caroline's daughters served as a demonstration project that challenged contemporary assumptions about women's intellectual capabilities. Their obvious competence in traditionally masculine subjects provided evidence that educational limitations were based on social convention rather than natural incapacity, while their achievements helped normalize the idea that women could excel in academic pursuits without losing their feminine qualities. Caroline's educational philosophy emphasized the development of critical thinking abilities rather than mere acquisition of information, reflecting her own intellectual training under Queen Sophia, Charlotte, and Leibniz. She wanted her daughters to be able to analyze complex issues, formulate independent judgments, and participate meaningfully in intellectual discourse, abilities that would serve them well regardless of their future roles in life. The tutors and instructors Caroline selected for her daughters were chosen based on their ability to recognize and nurture female intellectual potential rather than their willingness to accommodate traditional limitations. She sought educators who understood that women could benefit from rigorous intellectual training and who were committed to helping her daughters achieve their full potential. Caroline's support for women writers and intellectuals extended beyond her immediate family to include patronage for female authors, philosophers, and scientists throughout Britain and Europe. She provided financial support, social recognition, and access to audiences that were often denied to women seeking to participate in intellectual life. Her patronage of women intellectuals was particularly important because it provided them with the kind of institutional support and social legitimacy that was essential for serious scholarly work. Women who received Caroline's endorsement found it easier to publish their writings, attract audiences for their ideas, and build relationships with other scholars and intellectuals. Caroline's approach to supporting women writers reflected her understanding that intellectual achievement required not only individual talent, but also social structures that encouraged and rewarded excellence. By creating such structures within her sphere of influence, she helped establish precedents that would benefit future generations of women scholars. Her correspondence with leading female intellectuals of her time reveals both the breadth of her contacts and the depth of her engagement with contemporary intellectual developments. These letters show Caroline participating as an equal in discussions of philosophy, theology, science, and political theory, demonstrating her own intellectual achievements while encouraging similar development in other women. Caroline's influence on religious and theological discussions was particularly significant for women's advancement, as religious institutions provided some of the few opportunities for female intellectual participation in the 18th century society. Her support for educated female religious writers and theologians helped expand opportunities for women to contribute to important contemporary debates. Her approach to religious questions emphasized rational inquiry and personal spiritual development, rather than passive acceptance of traditional authorities, an approach that was particularly liberating for women who had often been discouraged from independent religious thinking. Caroline's example demonstrated that deep religious faith was compatible with intellectual independence and critical analysis. Caroline's patronage of female artists and musicians provided opportunities for women to develop professional careers in fields where talent and creativity could be recognized and rewarded. Her support helped establish the principle that artistic excellence should be judged on its merits, rather than the gender of its creator. The court culture that Caroline fostered provided a social environment where educated and accomplished women could interact with influential political and intellectual figures on terms of relative equality. Her evening gatherings included women who participated fully in discussions of literature, philosophy, and politics, challenging traditional assumptions about appropriate female behavior. Caroline's approach to charity and social reform reflected her understanding that women's welfare was closely connected to broader social and economic conditions. Rather than focusing exclusively on traditional female charitable activities, She supported initiatives that addressed systemic issues affecting women's opportunities and welfare. Her support for institutions that provided education and training for women of modest backgrounds reflected her understanding that expanding opportunities for women required addressing the needs of all social classes, rather than focusing exclusively on aristocratic women. She recognized that social progress depended on creating pathways for advancement that were accessible to women regardless of their birth circumstances. Caroline's influence on marriage and family law, while necessarily limited by her position, helped establish precedents for more equitable treatment of women within domestic relationships. Her own marriage provided a model of partnership and mutual respect that challenged traditional assumptions about appropriate relationships between husbands and wives. Her management of her own household and estates demonstrated women's capacity for effective administration and financial management, abilities that were often underestimated or ignored in the 18th century society. Caroline's success in these areas provided evidence that women could handle significant responsibilities when given appropriate opportunities. Caroline's approach to international relations included particular attention to the welfare and advancement of women in other countries, reflecting her understanding that women's progress required international cooperation and mutual support. Her correspondence with female rulers and influential women in other countries helped build networks of support for women's advancement across national boundaries. Her influence on legal and political developments, while necessarily indirect, helped establish precedents that would benefit future generations of women seeking greater participation in public life. Caroline's demonstrated competence in political affairs provided evidence that women could contribute effectively to governance when their abilities were recognized and utilized. The example of Caroline's own achievements served as powerful evidence for women's potential in virtually every area of human endeavor. Her intellectual accomplishments, political effectiveness, cultural leadership, and social influence demonstrated that traditional limitations on women's roles were based on prejudice rather than natural incapacity. Caroline's vision of women's advancement was both progressive and practical, recognizing that sustainable change required working within existing social structures while gradually expanding opportunities and challenging limitations. Her approach emphasized demonstrating women's capabilities rather than simply arguing for their rights, understanding that evidence of achievement would be more persuasive than theoretical arguments. Her legacy in advancing women's causes extended far beyond her immediate achievements to include the precedents she established, the networks she created, and the examples she provided. Many of the advances in women's education, professional opportunities, and social recognition that occurred in later generations could be traced to foundations laid during Caroline's reign. By the time of her death in 1737, Caroline had established herself as one of the most significant advocates for women's advancement in European history, using her position as Queen Consort to create opportunities, challenge assumptions, and demonstrate possibilities that would influence social development for generations to come. Her approach provided a model for how women in positions of influence could advance the cause of gender equality while working within existing social and political constraints. Caroline's commitment to women's advancement reflected both her personal convictions and her broader understanding of how social progress could serve national interests. She recognized that societies that fully utilized women's talents and capabilities would be more prosperous, stable, and creative than those that limited opportunities based on gender, making her feminist advocacy an integral part of her broader vision for social and political progress. Caroline's fourth and final regency, which began in May 1736, when George II departed for another extended visit to Hanover, would prove to be both the culmination of her political authority and the prelude to the personal and dynastic crises that would define her final year of life. At 53, Caroline had reached the height of her powers, commanding respect from politicians, diplomats, and the general public, while wielding influence that extended far beyond the traditional boundaries of queenly authority. The 1736 Regency occurred during a period of particular international tension, as the major European powers maneuvered for position in anticipation of future conflicts that would eventually culminate in the War of Austrian Succession. Caroline's management of foreign policy during this crucial period demonstrated her sophisticated understanding of international relations and her to protect British interests while maintaining the delicate balance of European power relationships. Her correspondence with foreign ambassadors and diplomatic representatives revealed the extent to which other European courts had come to recognize Caroline as the real center of authority in British governance. Diplomatic dispatches from this period consistently reported that securing Caroline's support was considered essential for any significant policy initiative, while her opposition was generally understood to be fatal to proposed agreements or alliances. Caroline's approach to international relations during the 1736 Regency reflected her characteristic combination of pragmatic calculation and principled commitment to British interests. She was willing to engage in complex negotiations and make tactical compromises when necessary, but she never lost sight of fundamental objectives or allowed short-term considerations to override strategic planning. The domestic political situation during the 1736 Regency was complicated by growing opposition to Walpole's policies, particularly regarding taxation and government expenditure. Caroline's role in managing these political challenges revealed both her continued commitment to supporting Walpole's administration and her growing awareness that their partnership might not be sustainable indefinitely. The opposition to Walpole's government had been building for several years, fueled by various grievances including the controversial Excise Bill, concerns about British involvement in European conflicts, and general fatigue with a ministry that had been in power for more than a decade. Caroline understood that these challenges required careful management to prevent them from undermining the stability of the Hanoverian dynasty. Her approach to managing political opposition during the Regency demonstrated her sophisticated understanding of parliamentary government and her to distinguish between legitimate policy disagreements and more fundamental threats to royal authority. She worked to address genuine grievances while maintaining support for policies that she considered essential for national welfare. Caroline's handling of the Porteous riots in Edinburgh provided a particularly clear demonstration of her political judgment and administrative capabilities. Captain John Porteous, who had been convicted of murder for ordering his men to fire on a crowd during a public execution, had appealed to the Crown for clemency, creating a delicate situation that required balancing legal justice with political considerations. Before Caroline could act on Porteous's appeal, a mob stormed the prison where he was being held and executed him themselves, creating a crisis that challenged royal authority while reflecting genuine popular anger about his alleged crimes. Caroline's response to this situation revealed her understanding of the complex relationship between royal prerogative, legal process, and popular sentiment. Rather than simply denouncing the mob's actions and demanding punishment for those involved, Caroline sought to understand the underlying grievances that had motivated the violence while working to restore respect for legal institutions. Her approach balanced the need to maintain royal authority with recognition that effective governance required addressing legitimate popular concerns. The international implications of the Porteous affair were also significant, as other European courts watched to see how the British government would respond to this challenge to royal authority. Caroline's handling of the situation helped maintain international confidence in British political stability, while demonstrating that the Hanoverian monarchy could manage domestic crises effectively. During the 1736 Regency, Caroline also had to manage growing concerns about George II's safety during his travels to and from Hanover. The journey across Europe was always potentially dangerous, involving sea voyages, overland travel through territories controlled by various rulers, and exposure to weather conditions that could create life-threatening situations. The most serious crisis occurred in late 1736, when George II's return journey to England was delayed by severe storms that made sea travel impossible for several weeks. Rumours began to circulate in London that the king's ship had been lost at sea, creating political uncertainty and raising questions about succession arrangements that Caroline had to manage carefully. Caroline's response to these rumours demonstrated her understanding of how quickly political situations could deteriorate when royal authority was perceived to be uncertain. She worked to maintain normal government operations while providing measured reassurances about the king's safety, avoiding both panic and premature celebrations that might have created additional complications. The eventual safe return of George II in January 1737 ended this particular crisis, but the experience highlighted the ongoing vulnerabilities created by the king's frequent absences from his kingdom. Caroline's management of these challenges demonstrated her ability to maintain political stability, even during periods of genuine uncertainty about royal succession. The 1736 Regency also marked a period of particular tension in Caroline's relationship with Frederick, who used his father's absence as an opportunity to expand his political activities and build support among opposition politicians. Frederick's behavior during this period revealed his growing sophistication as a political operator, while demonstrating his continued determination to challenge his parents' authority. Caroline's efforts to manage Frederick's opposition activities while maintaining family unity became increasingly difficult during this period. She understood that direct confrontation might push Frederick toward even more destructive behavior, but she also recognized that his activities were potentially damaging to the dynasty's stability and the government's effectiveness. The marriage negotiations for Frederick, which had been ongoing for several years, finally reached a conclusion during the 1736 Regency with his betrothal to Princess Augusta of Saxe-Gotha. Caroline had played a crucial role in these negotiations, seeing an appropriate marriage as potentially moderating Frederick's behavior while providing the dynasty with additional security through expanded European connections. The selection of Augusta reflected Caroline's careful consideration of both political and personal factors. The Saxon connection provided useful diplomatic advantages, while Augusta's personal qualities suggested that she might have a positive influence on Frederick's character and political activities. However, Caroline's hopes that marriage might improve Frederick's relationship with his family and moderate his political opposition proved to be overly optimistic. If anything, marriage seemed to provide Frederick with additional motivation for establishing his independence from parental authority, as he sought to create an alternative court that could rival that of his parents. By the end of the 1736 Regency, Caroline had successfully managed numerous domestic and international challenges while maintaining the political stability that had characterized her previous periods of temporary authority. However, she was also becoming increasingly aware of the limitations of her position and the potential vulnerabilities that might affect the dynasty's future. The growing opposition to Walpole's government, the continuing tensions with Frederick, and the uncertainties created by George II's frequent absences all represented challenges that would require ongoing attention and sophisticated management. Caroline understood that the political arrangements that had served the dynasty well during the early years of George II's reign might need modification to address changing circumstances. Her correspondence with George II during the 1736 Regency revealed her growing concerns about these various challenges, while demonstrating her continued commitment to maintaining the partnership with Walpole that had been so crucial to their political success. She recognized that changes might be necessary but hoped that they could be managed in ways that preserved the essential elements of their approach to governance. The conclusion of the 1736 Regency marked the end of Caroline's formal exercises of temporary royal authority, though she continued to wield significant influence over government policy through her relationship with George II. Looking back on her 4 regencies, it was clear that she had used these opportunities to demonstrate capabilities that extended far beyond traditional queenly roles, while establishing precedents that would influence constitutional development for generations. Caroline's success as a regent reflected her understanding that effective governance required balancing competing interests, managing complex relationships, and maintaining stability while addressing necessary changes. Her achievements in these temporary positions of authority provided strong evidence for women's capacity to exercise political leadership when given appropriate opportunities. As 1737 began, Caroline could look back on nearly a decade of exceptional political influence and achievement, having helped establish the Hanoverian dynasty's legitimacy while contributing to a period of relative stability and prosperity for Britain. However, the challenges that lay ahead would test her abilities to their utmost while revealing the personal costs of a life dedicated to political service and dynastic loyalty. The autumn of 1737 brought with it a subtle but ominous change in Caroline's daily routine, as she began to experience the first symptoms of the medical condition that would ultimately claim her life. For years, she had successfully concealed from public view an umbilical hernia that had developed following the difficult birth of her youngest child, Princess Louisa, in 1724. This condition, while not immediately life-threatening, had caused her periodic discomfort and had required her to modify her clothing and personal habits to avoid exacerbating the problem. Caroline's decision to hide her medical condition reflected both her personal vanity and her sophisticated understanding of the political implications that any sign of royal weakness might generate. In an age when a monarch's physical health was often interpreted as a reflection of divine favor and political legitimacy, admitting to any significant medical problem could have serious consequences for both personal authority and dynastic stability. The hernia itself was a consequence of the physical demands that Caroline's royal duties had placed upon her body over the years. 10 pregnancies in 22 years of marriage had weakened her abdominal muscles, while the restrictive clothing required by court protocol had prevented proper healing after childbirth. The combination of physical stress and inadequate medical understanding had created a condition that gradually worsened over time. On November 9th, 1737, Caroline was attending a reception to view the new library at St. James's Palace when she was struck by an intense abdominal pain that nearly caused her to collapse in public. Her years of practice in maintaining composure under difficult circumstances served her well, as she managed to complete her social. On November 9th, 1737, Caroline was attending a reception to view the new library at St. James's Palace when she was struck by an intense abdominal pain that nearly caused her to collapse in public. Her years of practice in maintaining composure under difficult circumstances served her well, as she managed to complete her social obligations and return to her private apartments before allowing the full extent of her distress to become apparent. Once in the privacy of her chambers, Caroline finally acknowledged that her long-concealed medical condition had entered a critical phase. The umbilical hernia that she had managed to hide for 13 years had become strangulated, meaning that a portion of her small intestine had become trapped in the hernia opening, cutting off blood supply to the affected tissue and creating a medical emergency that would prove beyond the capabilities of 18th century medicine. The initial response to Caroline's illness reflected the limited understanding of surgical conditions that characterized even the most advanced medical practice of the period. Her physicians, led by the royal surgeon John Ranby, initially diagnosed her condition as colic and prescribed various remedies, including the popular Daffy's elixir, a preparation that was supposed to address digestive complaints, but which had no effect on her actual condition. As Caroline's pain intensified over the following days, it became clear that more serious intervention would be necessary. The decision to attempt surgical repair of the strangulated hernia was made reluctantly, as surgery in 1737 carried enormous risks, even under the best circumstances, without anesthesia, antiseptic procedures, or adequate understanding of infection control. Any major operation was essentially a desperate gamble with death. The surgical procedure itself, performed on November 11th, revealed the full extent of Caroline's condition and the limitations of contemporary medical knowledge. Dr. Ranby and his colleagues found that a portion of Caroline's intestine had indeed become strangulated in the hernia opening, but their decision about how to address this problem would prove to be catastrophically wrong. Rather than attempting to gently manipulate the trapped intestine back into position and repair the hernia opening, the approach that modern medicine would recommend, the surgeons decided to remove the portion of intestine that appeared to be damaged. This decision, while understandable, given the medical knowledge of the time, essentially destroyed Caroline's digestive system and made her death inevitable. Caroline's behavior during the surgery revealed the remarkable courage and strength of character that had sustained her throughout her life. Despite the excruciating pain of major abdominal surgery performed without anesthesia, she maintained her sense of humor and continued to display concern for others even in her own extremity. She famously joked with Dr. Ranby before the surgery, saying, "Before you begin, let me have a full view of your comical face," and during the procedure asked, "What would you give now that you was cutting your wife?" The Queen's ability to maintain her wit and composure under such horrific circumstances impressed everyone who witnessed her ordeal. Her behavior during the surgery and the difficult days that followed became the subject of admiring comment throughout London society, adding to her reputation for exceptional character and personal strength. However, Caroline's remarkable courage could not overcome the medical realities created by the surgical intervention. The removal of a portion of her intestine had created internal damage that made normal digestion impossible, while the wound itself began to show signs of the infection that would ultimately prove fatal. Despite the various remedies attempted by her physicians, including brandy, mint water, and Sir Walter Raleigh's cordial, Caroline found herself unable to keep down food or even water. The political implications of Caroline's illness became apparent almost immediately, as news of her condition spread through London's political circles and began to affect government operations. Sir Robert Walpole, who understood better than anyone the extent of Caroline's influence over royal policy, recognized that her death would fundamentally alter the political landscape and potentially threaten his own position as chief minister. George II's response to his wife's illness revealed the depth of his emotional dependence on Caroline and his genuine devotion to her, despite his extramarital relationships. He established a cot in Caroline's bedroom and maintained an almost constant vigil by her side, refusing to attend to government business or royal ceremonial duties while she struggled with her condition. The king's obvious distress at Caroline's suffering surprised many observers who had focused primarily on his relationships with various mistresses and had underestimated the emotional bonds that united the royal couple. His willingness to risk his own health by remaining in close contact with Caroline during her illness demonstrated a level of personal devotion that contradicted public perceptions of their marriage as primarily a political arrangement. Caroline's management of her own dying process revealed the same political intelligence and emotional sensitivity that had characterized her approach to life. Despite her own suffering, she continued to concern herself with the welfare of others and the implications of her death for the dynasty's future stability. Her most emotionally difficult decision involved her relationship with Frederick, who requested permission to visit his dying mother, despite their years of bitter conflict. Caroline's initial response was to refuse this request, but she eventually relented sufficiently to send Frederick a message of forgiveness through Walpole, though she maintained her refusal to see him in person. This decision reflected Caroline's complex feelings toward her eldest son, her genuine desire for reconciliation competing with her justified anger about his behavior, and her concern that a deathbed meeting might create additional political complications. Her choice to offer forgiveness while maintaining distance represented a characteristically sophisticated attempt to balance personal emotions with political necessities. Caroline's conversations with George II during her final days addressed practical concerns about the monarchy's future, as well as personal matters relating to their relationship. Her urging that he remarry after her death reflected her understanding that the kingdom would benefit from having a queen consort, while her concern for his emotional welfare demonstrated the genuine affection that had sustained their marriage despite its challenges. George II's famous response to Caroline's suggestion that he remarry, "No, I shall have only mistresses," has often been interpreted as evidence of his frivolous character, but it actually reflected the depth of his emotional attachment to Caroline and his genuine belief that no other woman could adequately replace her. Caroline's reply, "Ah, mon Dieu, cela n'empêche pas," "My God, that doesn't prevent it," demonstrated her practical understanding of political necessities even in her final moments. The progression of Caroline's illness followed a predictable but agonizing course as infections spread throughout her abdomen and her body's systems began to shut down. The burst intestinal wound that occurred on November 17 marked the beginning of her final decline, though she would linger for 3 more days in increasing discomfort. During these final days, Caroline received visits from her children and close associates, using these opportunities to provide guidance and support for those who would continue to serve the dynasty after her death. Her conversations with her daughters revealed her continued concern for their education and future welfare, while her discussions with court officials demonstrated her ongoing attention to political and administrative matters. Caroline's death on the evening of November 20th, 1737, occurred with the same dignity and grace that had characterized her approach to life. Surrounded by her family and closest associates, she faced her final moments with calm acceptance, asking for a window to be opened and speaking a final word, "Pray," before quietly slipping away. The immediate aftermath of Caroline's death revealed the extent to which British political and social life had come to depend on her influence and guidance. The shock felt throughout London. Society reflected not only personal affection for the Queen, but also genuine concern about how the monarchy and government would function without her steadying presence. George II's grief at Caroline's death was both profound and prolonged, affecting his ability to fulfill his royal duties for months after her passing. His arrangement for their eventual joint burial, matching coffins with removable sides so that they could lie together when he followed her to the grave, demonstrated his intention to maintain their partnership even in death. The public response to Caroline's death included genuine mourning from subjects who had come to appreciate her contributions to the kingdom's welfare, as well as political speculation about how her absence might affect government policy and dynastic stability. The universal recognition of her exceptional abilities and achievements provided fitting tribute to a life dedicated to service and excellence. George Frederick Handel's composition of The Ways of Zion Do Mourn for Caroline's funeral represented not only a magnificent musical tribute, but also recognition of her significant role in supporting British cultural life. The anthem's premiere at Westminster Abbey on December 17, 1737, provided a suitably dignified conclusion to the public ceremonies honouring Caroline's memory. Frederick's exclusion from his mother's funeral, while understandable given their bitter relationship, also represented a missed opportunity for family reconciliation that might have served the dynasty's broader interests. Caroline's inability to heal this crucial relationship remained one of the few significant failures of her otherwise extraordinarily successful life. The medical details of Caroline's final illness, while necessarily distressing, provide important insights into both the limitations of 18th century medicine and the exceptional courage displayed by patients who faced serious conditions without the benefits of modern pain management or surgical techniques. Caroline's ordeal highlighted the vulnerability of even the most powerful individuals to medical conditions that would be easily treatable today. Her death at the age of 54 represented not only a personal tragedy for those who loved her, but also a significant loss for British political and cultural life. The qualities that had made Caroline such an effective queen consort, her intelligence, political skill, cultural sophistication, and personal courage, were rare in any era, and particularly valuable during the challenging period when the Hanoverian dynasty was still establishing its legitimacy. The circumstances of Caroline's final illness also revealed the complex relationship between personal privacy and public responsibility that faced all members of royal families. Her decision to conceal her medical condition for so many years, while understandable given the political implications of royal weakness, ultimately contributed to the severity of her final crisis and demonstrated the personal costs of maintaining public image under such demanding circumstances. The depth and duration of George II's grief following Caroline's death surprised even those who had observed their marriage closely, revealing emotional bonds that had been obscured by the king's well-publicized relationships with various mistresses. His response to Caroline's loss demonstrated that their partnership had been based on genuine affection and mutual dependence rather than merely political convenience or dynastic obligation. George II's immediate reaction to Caroline's death was one of complete emotional collapse, a response so profound that it raised serious concerns about his ability to continue fulfilling his royal duties. For weeks after the funeral, he remained largely secluded in his private apartments, refusing to participate in court ceremonies or conduct government business, except when absolutely necessary for the kingdom's welfare. The king's arrangement for matching coffins with removable sides so that he and Caroline could eventually lie together revealed both the romantic nature of his attachment to her and his intention to maintain their partnership even beyond death. This decision, made in the immediate aftermath of her passing, represented one of the most touching expressions of marital devotion in royal history. George II's famous declaration that he would have only mistresses rather than remarry was not the flippant comment it might appear, but rather a profound statement of his belief that Caroline could never be replaced. His subsequent behavior confirmed the sincerity of this declaration, as he never again formed any romantic attachment that approached the depth of his relationship with Caroline. The 23 years that George II lived following Caroline's death were marked by her continuing influence on his decisions and policies, as he frequently asked himself what Caroline would have advised in various situations. Her memory served as a continuing source of guidance and comfort, demonstrating that her influence extended far beyond her physical presence. The king's instructions for his own burial, specified years before his death, included detailed provisions for the removal of his coffin side panel so that he could join Caroline in death as he had been joined to her in life. This arrangement carried out when George II died in 1760, represented the ultimate fulfillment of his commitment to their eternal partnership. Caroline of Ansbach's death marked the end of one of the most remarkable careers in the history of European monarchy, but her influence on British constitutional development, cultural life, and social progress continued long after her passing. Her legacy extended far beyond her immediate achievements to include precedents, institutions, and ideas that would shape British society for generations. Her demonstration that a queen consort could exercise significant political influence while maintaining constitutional proprieties established important precedents for future royal wives and contributed to the evolution of Britain's unique system of constitutional monarchy. Caroline proved that effective informal power could complement rather than challenge formal constitutional arrangements. The intellectual and cultural institutions that flourished under Caroline's patronage continued to influence British life long after her death, helping establish Britain's reputation as a centre of Enlightenment learning and cultural achievement. Her support for education, scientific research, and artistic excellence created foundations that supported continued progress in these areas. Caroline's approach to international relations, emphasizing diplomatic solutions over military conflicts and careful attention to the balance of European power, provided models that influenced British foreign policy for decades. Her understanding of the complex relationships between domestic stability and international prestige helped establish principles that guided British diplomacy through numerous subsequent crises. Her championing of women's education and advancement, while necessarily limited by the social constraints of her era, established precedents and created networks that supported continued progress toward greater gender equality. Caroline's own achievements provided powerful evidence for women's capabilities, while her support for other women created opportunities that might not otherwise have existed. The partnership between Caroline and Robert Walpole demonstrated how effective collaboration between royal and ministerial authority could serve both constitutional principles and practical governance needs. Their working relationship provided a model for future cooperation between monarchs and prime ministers that helped stabilize British political development. Caroline's management of court culture and social relationships established standards for royal behavior that emphasized merit, learning, and genuine achievement over mere ceremony or personal connections. Her approach to queenship provided a template for how royal authority could be exercised to promote broader social and cultural progress. And so ends the remarkable story of Caroline of Ansbach, a woman who wore no crown yet ruled with wisdom, wielded no sword yet conquered through intelligence, held no formal office yet shaped the destiny of nations through the power of her extraordinary mind and indomitable spirit. From the small German principality, where she was born, to the grand courts of Europe, where she learned and grew, from the intellectual salons of Berlin to the political corridors of Westminster, Caroline's journey was one of constant growth, unwavering determination, and exceptional achievement. She transformed every challenge into an opportunity, every setback into a foundation for future success. Her legacy lives on in the constitutional traditions she helped establish, the cultural institutions she nurtured, the educational precedents she created, and the example of intelligent, principled leadership she provided for future generations. Caroline proved that true power comes not from formal authority, but from the ability to inspire, guide, and serve others with wisdom and compassion. As you drift toward peaceful sleep, let Caroline's story remind you that extraordinary lives are built not through dramatic gestures, but through daily choices to learn, grow, and contribute to the welfare of others. Her invisible crown was worn with greater dignity than many visible ones. Her reign without formal power more effective than many conducted with absolute authority. Sleep well, dear listener, And may your dreams be filled with the gentle wisdom of this remarkable queen who ruled through love, guided through intelligence, and left the world better than she found it. Thank you for joining us on this extended journey through one of history's most fascinating lives and sweet dreams, until we meet again in the peaceful realm of Sleepy Crown.